Imagine darkness, not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom or the soft dimness of a cinema before the film begins, but the vast, indifferent darkness of the North Atlantic on a moonless April night. The ocean is black as polished obsidian, and above it countless stars burn with a clarity that feels almost cruel. The air is bitterly cold, carried south by Arctic currents untouched by warmth or sunlight. Then something impossible appears. At first, you hear it rather than see it. A low vibration, a steady pulse felt in your bones more than your ears, as though the ocean itself has begun to hum. Then come the lights, hundreds of them, not scattered randomly like distant shore lights, but arranged in perfect rows and columns, rising from the darkness in a pattern so vast that your mind struggles to understand what it is seeing. Nothing on water is supposed to look like this. Nothing built by human hands is supposed to be this large. Slowly, the shape emerges. For immense funnels climb toward the stars. A hull stretches across the sea like a moving city. The bow parts the black water with effortless confidence, throwing white spray into the night. Only now does the scale become clear. This is not merely a ship. It is a floating world of steel, glass, timber, and ambition, so enormous that it seems to challenge common sense itself, so vast that the Atlantic appears less like an ocean and more like a road beneath it. Moving steadily through the darkness, illuminated against the night sky, it looks less like a vessel than a monument. Its name is RMS Titanic, and in April 1912, many believed it was the closest thing to an unsinkable ship the world would ever see. And you already know that name. You have always known that name. Everyone knows that name. Titanic is one of those rare words that has transcended language and geography and the passage of time to become something almost mythological. A word that carries within it an entire world of meaning. A word that conjures images and emotions and questions in the minds of people who were not yet born when the ship itself sailed. People who know almost nothing about the Edwardian era or the economics of transatlantic shipping or the metallurgy of steel production in early 20th century. Belfast. Titanic. The word resonates like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. You hear it, and something happens to you. Something quickens. But here is the question that this story will pursue through all of its long and complicated hours. The question that has haunted historians and engineers and novelists and dreamers for more than a century now. Why? Why the ship? Thousands of vessels have sailed the ocean since human beings first lashed logs together and trusted themselves to the water. Hundreds of ships have sunk, taking with them thousands of lives, sometimes tens of thousands of lives. Catastrophes at sea have occurred throughout all of recorded history. Tragedies of staggering proportion, losses that should by any measure have commanded the same kind of permanent, collective grief that Titanic still commands today. And yet those ships are forgotten. Their names are unknown to anyone but specialists. Their stories have been swallowed by time and the indifferent rolling of the sea. So why does Titanic still matter? Why does its story still have the power to stop a person in their tracks, to produce a catch of breath, a quickening of the pulse? Why do the names of people who sailed on it, people who lived and died more than a century ago, in a world so different from our own that it might as well be another planet? Why do those names still carry weight, still feel personal, still feel like a loss that belongs to all of us? The answer, as with most profound historical questions, is not a simple one. The sinking of Titanic was not merely a maritime disaster. It was something richer and stranger and more complicated than that. It was a collision between the most powerful dream of a civilization and the oldest, most indifferent force on Earth. It was a story about human ambition and human fragility, about the things we build to prove our mastery of the world and the world's effortless capacity to remind us of our smallness. It was a story that arrived at precisely the right moment in history, in a particular month of a particular year, to be witnessed by the first truly global media culture, to be transmitted around the world with a speed that had never before been possible, to reach millions of people in their homes, in their workplaces, in their streets, and to lodge itself permanently in the collective imagination of an entire civilization. But before the collision, before the iceberg and the darkness and the tragedy that has echoed down through all the decades since, there was the dream. And the dream was magnificent. To understand what Titanic meant to the people who built it and sailed it and waited for it on the docks of New York, you have to understand the world in which it was born. You have to travel back to a moment in history that was, in many ways, one of the most extraordinary moments the human race has ever experienced. A moment of such rapid and profound transformation that the people living through it could scarcely believe the evidence of their own eyes. The late 19th century and the early years of the 20th were a time of almost hallucinatory change. In the space of a single human lifetime, the world had been transformed from a place that would have been broadly recognizable to someone from the ancient world, a world of muscle and wind and fire, of horses and sailing ships and candles, into something that would have seemed like pure magic to anyone living just a few generations before. Steam engines had replaced horses. Electric lights had replaced candles. Telegraphs had replaced messengers on horseback, and those telegraphs had then been supplemented by telephones, so that a person in London could speak in real time with a person in New York. Steel had replaced iron. Petroleum had replaced whale oil. Automobiles were beginning to replace carriages. Aeroplanes, heavier-than-air flying machines that would have been dismissed as fantasy by anyone born before 1850, had actually flown, had actually carried human beings through the sky. At a place called Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, just a handful of years before Titanic was laid down in Belfast. This was progress. This was human ingenuity made manifest, the accumulated intelligence and creativity and determination of the species, applied to the project of mastering the physical world. And the mastery felt total. It felt permanent. It felt like the fulfillment of something that had been promised since the beginning of civilization, since the first human being looked at the forces of nature and said, "We can do better than this. We can build something to stand against the cold, to cross the water, to carry more than we can carry on our backs, to travel faster than our legs can take us, to illuminate the dark." The entire arc of human history had been bending toward this moment, and the people living in it could feel the arc, could feel the momentum of it, and the feeling was intoxicating. Nowhere was this feeling more intense than in the great industrial cities of the Western world. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Pittsburgh and Chicago, where the air was perpetually thick with smoke and the nights were orange with the glow of furnaces, where factories ran 24 hours a day and the sound of machinery never completely ceased. These were places where the transformation of the world was happening in real time, where raw materials from distant continents were being fed into enormous machines and emerging as finished goods, as engines and textiles and chemicals and tools, as the physical substance of modernity itself. And among all the industries driving this transformation, the shipping industry occupied a special place. Because the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean above all others, was the artery through which the blood of the global economy flowed. In the first decade of the 20th century, the Atlantic was not merely a body of water. It was the most important transportation corridor on Earth. It was the highway along which millions of immigrants traveled from the overcrowded, underpaid, often violent conditions of Europe toward the promise of America. It was the route by which the raw materials of the New World, cotton and grain and timber and copper and petroleum, traveled to the factories of the Old World. And it was the channel through which finished goods, ideas, fashions, and information moved in both directions, knitting together a civilization that was beginning, for the first time in history, to think of itself as genuinely global. To carry all of this traffic, all of these people and goods and ideas, required ships. And the ships of this era were not the modest, workaday vessels of earlier centuries. They were leviathans. They were the largest, most complex, most expensive machines ever built by human beings. They were objects of genuine public fascination, followed in the newspapers with the same breathless attention that people today devote to technology launches or space missions. When a new ship was launched, when the keel of something enormous slipped for the first time into the water, when the hull that had spent years taking shape on the stocks of a great shipyard finally committed itself to its natural element, people came from miles away to watch. They cheered. They wept. They took photographs and sent telegrams and wrote long, admiring articles about what they had witnessed. Because these ships were not just machines. They were symbols. They were the most visible, tangible evidence of a nation's industrial power, of its engineering genius, of its capacity to organize vast amounts of human labor and material resources toward a single, magnificent purpose. A great ocean liner was, in a very real sense, a statement. A statement about who you were and what you were capable of, a claim made in steel and steam on behalf of an entire civilization. And in the first years of the 20th century, that competition, the competition for maritime supremacy on the North Atlantic, was as intense as any commercial rivalry the world had ever seen. The German shipping companies had been particularly aggressive. Hamburg America and Norddeutscher Lloyd had, during the 1890s and early 1900s, launched a series of increasingly large and fast ocean liners that had stolen the prestigious Blue Ribbon, the unofficial prize awarded to the fastest crossing of the Atlantic, from the British lines that had held it for decades. The Germans had also made enormous inroads into the passenger trade, offering ships that were not just fast, but genuinely comfortable, genuinely elegant, genuinely appealing to the wealthy Americans and Europeans who represented the most profitable segment of the market. For the British, this was a matter of national prestige as much as commercial concern. Britain had built its empire on maritime dominance. The Royal Navy ruled the waves. British merchant shipping had for centuries been the backbone of global trade. The great British shipping companies, Cunard above all, had been, for generations, the most admired and profitable carriers on the Atlantic. To see this preeminence challenged by German competitors, to see the blue ribbon hanging in Hamburg rather than Liverpool, was deeply uncomfortable. It felt like an early symptom of something larger, a hint of a shift in the balance of power that the British were not yet ready to acknowledge. The response from the British side came in the form of money and ambition and engineering. Cunard, with the support of a substantial loan from the British government, a loan specifically intended to help Britain reassert its maritime supremacy, commissioned two ships designed to be not merely large, but transformatively, almost incomprehensibly large. They were to be the fastest ships on the ocean, capable of crossing the Atlantic in under 5 days, capable of carrying nearly 2,000 passengers in conditions of unprecedented comfort. Their names were Lusitania and Mauretania, and when they entered service in 1907, they did exactly what they had been built to do. Mauretania claimed the blue ribbon and held it, with extraordinary tenacity, for the next 22 years. The British were back. But there was another player in this drama, a company that had watched the speed race with a certain aristocratic detachment, a company that had decided, quite deliberately and quite consciously, that speed was not its game. That company was the White Star Line. White Star had a history as long and complicated as the Atlantic trade itself, a history of triumphs and disasters and reinventions. But by the first years of the 20th century, it had found its identity, and that identity was built on a single word: luxury. White Star believed, and its experience on the North Atlantic had confirmed, that the most profitable passenger was not the passenger in a hurry, but the passenger who wanted to be pampered. The wealthy American industrialist who had 6 days to spare and wanted to spend them eating exquisite food and drinking fine wine and sleeping in a bed that felt nothing like anything available on any ship previously built. The British aristocrat traveling to New York for business who wanted a drawing room rather than a cabin, who expected service of a caliber that would not have been out of place in the finest hotels of London or Paris. The wealthy widow, the successful manufacturer, the celebrated author, all of the people who had money and taste and the inclination to spend both, and who would choose the ship that made them feel most thoroughly themselves. White Star catered to these people. It had done so for decades, building ships that were somewhat slower than Cunard's Greyhounds, but considerably more comfortable. Ships with wider corridors, larger staterooms, better food, more attentive service. And it had been profitable, handsomely profitable, because the people who sailed White Star were exactly the kind of people who spent freely aboard a ship and who recommended the line to their wealthy friends. But by 1907, even White Star could see that something needed to change. Cunard's new ships, Lusitania and Mauretania, were not just fast. They were beautiful and comfortable, well-appointed and well-run. They threatened to capture not just the speed market, but the luxury market as well. And that was territory White Star could not afford to cede. Something had to be done, something larger than anything that had been done before. The meeting that changed everything took place at a private dinner in the summer of 1907. The host was Lord William Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff, the great Belfast shipbuilding firm that had been White Star's exclusive builder for decades. The guest was J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line. The two men knew each other well. Their professional relationship was one of the most important in the history of transatlantic shipping, and they had dined together many times. But this particular dinner, at Peary's Grand London townhouse in Belgrave Square, was different. This dinner was the beginning of something. What they discussed, over the course of that evening, was a vision, not merely of a new ship, but of a new class of ships, a response to Cunard so overwhelming that it would settle the question of maritime supremacy for a generation. The idea was not to build the fastest ships on the ocean. That race was already won, and won convincingly, by Mauritania and Lusitania. The idea was to build the largest ships on the ocean. Ships so magnificent in scale, so extraordinary in comfort, so genuinely spectacular in every detail of their conception and execution, that speed would simply become irrelevant. Who cared about arriving a day earlier if the journey itself was so pleasurable that you didn't want it to end? The ships would be called Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic. 3 vessels, each one nearly 900 feet long, each one displacing more than 46,000 tons, each one capable of carrying over 2,000 passengers and nearly 900 crew members. They would be, by a significant margin, the largest moving objects ever constructed by human beings. They would be floating cities, self-contained worlds of extraordinary luxury, equipped with restaurants and swimming pools and Turkish baths and gymnasiums and libraries and squash courts and smoking rooms and gardens under glass. They would render everything that had gone before them not merely obsolete but quaint, like comparing the Wright brothers flyer to a modern airliner. The plan was audacious. It was, perhaps, the most audacious commercial project of the Edwardian era. And it would require not just money, though it would require enormous amounts of money, but the full organizational and engineering capacity of one of the most capable industrial operations on Earth. That operation was Harland and Wolff, and its home was Belfast. To understand Harland and Wolff, you need to understand Belfast, or rather, you need to understand what Belfast had become by the early years of the 20th century. Because the city that existed when Harland and Wolff's great shipyard was taking shape was a very different place from the modest market town it had been just a few decades before. The Industrial Revolution had come to Belfast with ferocious energy. The city had grown from a population of under 20,000 at the beginning of the 19th century to nearly 400,000 by the time Titanic's keel was laid. It had grown because work was available, because the linen mills and the rope works and the foundries and, above all, the shipyard offered employment to people flooding in from the surrounding countryside and from across Ireland, people who had come looking for wages and who had found them, even if the wages were often modest and the work was often brutal and the conditions were often dangerous. Belfast in 1907 was a city of industry and ambition and considerable civic pride, a city that had built magnificent public buildings and wide Victorian streets and comfortable suburbs for its professional class, while simultaneously maintaining the cramped, smoke-blackened terraces where most of its working population lived. It was a city divided by religion and politics in ways that would eventually produce some of the most terrible violence of the 20th century. But it was also a city united by a remarkable tradition of craftsmanship, by the particular pride that comes from making difficult things well, from knowing that your hands have contributed to the creation of something genuinely extraordinary. And nowhere was this pride more concentrated than at the shipyard. Harland and Wolff's Queen's Island facility was, by the early 20th century, simply one of the greatest industrial enterprises on Earth. It occupied a peninsula in Belfast Lough, a vast expanse of quays and sheds, and covered ways and engine shops and fitting out berths that stretched for miles along the waterfront. It employed, at its peak, more than 14,000 men. Men who worked in conditions that would be considered completely unacceptable today, without the safety equipment and the regulatory protections and the medical care that we take for granted. Men who fell from heights and were caught between machines and were burned and deafened and slowly poisoned by the chemicals and materials of their trade. They worked these jobs because the jobs were there, because the money was needed, because the shipyard was as inevitable a feature of their world as the sky above it. The man who ran this vast enterprise was William James Peary, and if you want to understand why Titanic was built the way it was, you need to understand Peary. He was one of the most powerful industrialists in the British Empire, a man who had risen from apprentice to chairman through a combination of technical brilliance, political acumen, and sheer force of personality. He had been with Harland and Wolff since 1862, had seen the company grow from a modest yard into a global powerhouse, and had guided much of that growth himself. He understood ships the way a great musician understands music, not just technically, not just mechanically, but intuitively, with a deep feeling for what was possible and what was beautiful and what would make the people who traveled on them feel that they had experienced something genuinely exceptional. Peary was also a man of considerable social ambition. He had been born into the comfortable but not aristocratic middle class of Victorian Belfast, and he had climbed, through the extraordinary success of his career, into the innermost circles of British power. He had been made a baronet, then a baron, then a viscount. He sat in the House of Lords. He dined with prime ministers. His wife, Margaret Peary, was a woman of equal intelligence and ambition who served as his closest advisor and an indefatigable hostess, maintaining the social connections through which so much of the real business of the Edwardian world was conducted. In 1907, Peary was 60 years old, at the absolute height of his power and his ambition, and the project that he and Ismay had conceived at that dinner in Belgrave Square was, in many ways, the culmination of everything he had been working toward. The Olympic-class ships would be the definitive statement of Harland and Wolff's supremacy. They would demonstrate, beyond any possibility of argument, that the Belfast yard could build anything, could solve any engineering problem, could produce work of any scale and any level of quality. They would be Peary's legacy. To execute the project, Peary turned to the man who had become, in the years since his arrival at the yard, his most trusted technical collaborator. His name was Thomas Andrews, and he was, by every account, one of the most gifted naval architects of his generation. Andrews was Peary's nephew, which had certainly helped him get his start at the yard, but everything he had achieved since that start he had earned entirely on his own merits. He had entered Harland and Wolff as an apprentice, worked his way through every department of the shipbuilding operation, the joiner's shop, the engine works, the drawing office, the construction floor, learning from the bottom up, developing the comprehensive understanding of the shipbuilding process that would make him such an invaluable designer. By 1907, he was head of the design department, responsible for overseeing the technical development of every vessel that came through the yard, and he was beloved. Not just respected, not merely professionally admired, but genuinely beloved, by the workers on the floor who saw him moving through the yard every day, stopping to examine their work, asking questions, listening to answers, treating everyone he encountered with the same courtesy and genuine interest, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Andrews was 34 years old when the Olympic-class project was assigned to him, dark-haired and handsome, with a quiet intensity that his colleagues found magnetic. He was unmarried. His engagement to Helen Riley Barber, the daughter of a prominent linen manufacturer, was just beginning, and he lived and breathed the work, spending long hours at his drawing table, sometimes arriving at the yard before dawn and leaving long after dark, poring over the calculations and the drawings and the specifications that would translate the concept conceived at Peary's dinner table into an actual vessel capable of floating on the North Atlantic. The design challenges were immense. Building a ship of this scale, 900 feet in length, a beam of 92 feet, a depth from keel to boat deck of nearly 100 feet, required solving problems that had never been solved before, required pushing the existing technology of shipbuilding to its absolute limits, and sometimes beyond. Every structural calculation, every assessment of loads and stresses and material properties, had to be performed manually, by hand, using the mathematical tools available in the early 20th century. No computers, no finite element analysis, no computer-aided design. Just pencil and paper and trained human minds, working through problems of staggering complexity. The hull itself was to be constructed of steel, specifically, of steel plates produced at mills in Scotland and Wales, plates that would be brought to Belfast by ship and then shaped and joined at the yard. The structural design of the hull required a careful balance between rigidity and flexibility, between a structure strong enough to withstand the enormous forces imposed by the North Atlantic, the weight of the water pressing against the hull, the bending moments created by the ship moving through waves, the stresses of a fully loaded vessel in a heavy sea, and a structure light enough not to make the ship too heavy to function efficiently. The propulsion system presented its own set of challenges. Titanic was to be driven by a combination of reciprocating steam engines, vast, complex machines of a kind that had been refined over decades of shipbuilding experience, and a steam turbine, a newer technology that offered significant advantages in terms of fuel efficiency and power output. The combination of the two systems was unusual, even experimental, and required careful design work to ensure that they could be integrated smoothly and reliably. And then there was the interior. Because Titanic was not, at bottom, a machine designed to move cargo across an ocean. It was a machine designed to make human beings feel comfortable and happy and well cared for during the time they spend aboard it. And the design of those human spaces, the staterooms and restaurants and lounges and promenades, and all the thousand small details that would constitute the passenger's experience of the ship, was in some ways the most demanding design challenge of all. Because you could calculate the strength of a steel plate, you could measure the output of a steam engine, but how do you calculate the experience of luxury? How do you design magnificence? The answer, as Andrews and his team developed it, was to look at the finest hotels in the world and to bring their standards, and in some cases their actual designers and craftsmen, to the ship. White Star had already developed a reputation for fine interiors, but what was planned for the Olympic class transcended anything the line had previously attempted. The first-class accommodations were to be organized not as traditional ship cabins, but as a genuine hotel experience, with a range of stateroom types from comfortable standard rooms to palatial suites that included separate bedrooms, sitting rooms, private promenades, and bathrooms with full-sized bathtubs. The public rooms for first-class passengers were to be organized along a central staircase that became one of the most celebrated design elements of the entire ship. The grand staircase descended through several decks, illuminated by a large dome of wrought iron and glass, paneled in carved oak in the style of the great English country houses of the 17th century, with a large ornamental clock flanked by allegorical figures at its first landing. This staircase was not merely a functional means of moving between decks. It was a statement, a declaration that arriving at the top of this staircase and descending into the dining saloon below was an event worthy of the occasion, that the ship itself understood the importance of making an entrance. The first-class dining saloon was the largest room afloat, larger than the dining rooms of most of the great hotels the ship's designers had used as their models. It could seat over 500 passengers at a single sitting, served by a staff of trained waiters who would have been at home in any of the finest restaurants in London or Paris or New York. The menu was not merely extensive but genuinely accomplished, drawing on the traditions of classical French cuisine as interpreted by a kitchen team of considerable ability. Adjacent to the main dining saloon was the à la carte restaurant, operated by the Luigi Gatti organization, which also ran the famous Ritz restaurant in London. And here the comparison to a first-class hotel was explicit and intentional. Passengers who wished to dine in the restaurant rather than the main saloon could do so at any time, ordering from an extensive menu of dishes prepared to order, in an environment decorated in the Louis XVI style, all gilded wood paneling and rose-colored carpet and the soft light of elaborate chandeliers. It was, quite deliberately, Paris aboard a ship. There was also the Café Parisien, a glass-enclosed space decorated with climbing ivy to give the impression of an outdoor café on a French boulevard, where passengers could take afternoon tea or light refreshments in surroundings that seemed transported directly from the left bank. There was the smoking room, paneled in dark mahogany and stained glass, where the gentlemen retired after dinner. There were 2 libraries, a card room, a reception room, a gymnasium equipped with the latest in mechanical exercise apparatus. There was a heated saltwater swimming pool, the first on any ocean liner, and a Turkish bath complex decorated with tiles in an elaborate blue and green pattern inspired by the baths of ancient Rome. There was a squash court. There was a darkroom for photographers. There were kennels for passengers' dogs. The ambition of all of this was breathtaking. And it is important to understand that this ambition was not merely aesthetic or commercial, though it was certainly both of those things. It was also, in a very real sense, ideological. It expressed a particular vision of what civilization had achieved and what it was capable of achieving, a vision in which human ingenuity had mastered not just the physical world, but the experience of moving through it, had made the crossing of the most treacherous ocean on Earth not just safe, but genuinely, unambiguously pleasurable. But the ship did not exist to carry only the wealthy. A vessel of this scale, making the crossing between Southampton and New York, needed to carry as many passengers as could be accommodated, and that meant second class and third class as well. Second class aboard Titanic was, by contemporary standards, extremely good. The second-class accommodations offered a level of comfort that would have been considered first class on many other lines. Comfortable two- and four-berth cabins, a well-appointed dining room, a library, a lounge, a smoking room. The food was substantial and well-prepared. The service was attentive. The spaces were well-lit and clean and reasonably spacious. White Star had long recognized that the second-class passenger represented a significant and growing market, the prosperous middle-class traveler. The businessmen and professionals and academics who could not afford or could not justify the cost of first class, but who expected a level of comfort commensurate with their status, and the company had designed accordingly. Third class was the subject of considerable attention as well, and for reasons that were as much commercial as humanitarian. The great mass of third-class passengers on the North Atlantic run in the first decade of the 20th century were immigrants, men, women, and families who were leaving their homes in Europe and crossing the Atlantic in search of new lives in America. They came from all over, from the struggling towns of Ireland, from the rural villages of Scandinavia and Germany, from the impoverished regions of Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, Poland, Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where economic opportunity had effectively ceased to exist and where the alternative to emigration was a life of grinding poverty or, increasingly, the threat of violence and persecution. These people were, in many ways, the most important passengers on the Atlantic run. There were more of them, in absolute numbers, than there were first- and second-class passengers combined. The money they paid for their tickets, modest individually, substantial in aggregate, represented a significant portion of the line's revenue. And the regulations governing how they were transported were becoming increasingly strict, as the American government's immigration authorities demanded better conditions for the people arriving at Ellis Island and other ports of entry. Titanic's third-class accommodations represented a genuine improvement over what had been available on previous ships. The cabins, actual enclosed cabins, not the open dormitory berths that had been standard on earlier vessels, were small but clean, with 4 to 6 berths per cabin. There was a dining room rather than the traditional system of passengers bringing their own food. There were common rooms where passengers could gather and talk, and, in the evenings, dance to music provided by whoever among them happened to play an instrument. The food was plain but adequate, soups and stews and bread and pudding, the kind of food that most of these passengers would have recognized from their lives at home. The third-class experience aboard Titanic was not luxurious, and it was not intended to be, but it was human. It treated the people who occupied it as human beings rather than as cargo, which had not always been the case on the Atlantic immigrant run, and that distinction mattered enormously to the men and women who were entrusting their futures and their families to this ship. Among those who would sail on Titanic's maiden voyage in the spring of 1912 were people from dozens of countries, speaking scores of languages, carrying in their baggage the entire weight of the lives they were leaving behind and the entire weight of the hopes they were carrying forward. There were Swedes and Finns and Croatians and Lebanese and Irish and British and Americans and Armenians and people of so many other nations and backgrounds that the ship, seen from a certain angle, was less a vessel than a kind of small, floating world, a miniature of the civilization it was crossing the ocean to serve. But all of that, the passengers, the hopes, the crossings, was still in the future when the keel of Titanic was laid down on the stocks at Harland and Wolff on the last day of March 1909. The laying of a keel was, in the shipbuilding tradition, a moment of ceremony. A keel, the long, central structural spine of a ship, the piece from which all else is built upward, represented the first, definitive commitment to the existence of a vessel. Before the keel was laid, a ship was an idea, a set of drawings, a series of calculations. After the keel was laid, it was real. It was a thing in the world, a physical object that would eventually float on water, and the process of its transformation from a line of steel on the stocks of a Belfast shipyard to a completed ocean liner was underway. The number of that keel, the yard number assigned by Harland and Wolff to every vessel they built, A simple administrative designation that had no particular significance, but that would eventually come to seem almost uncanny in retrospect, was 401. Hull 401 would sail the Atlantic as RMS Titanic. The work that followed was, by any measure, one of the greatest industrial undertakings of the Edwardian age. Building Titanic required the construction of two enormous gantries, scaffolding structures of steel so tall that they could be seen for miles across the flat landscape around Belfast Lough, and the deployment of thousands of workers organized into specialized teams, each team responsible for a specific aspect of the construction process. The riveters were among the most skilled of these workers and the most celebrated. Riveting was the primary method of joining steel plates and structural members in Edwardian shipbuilding, and it was an intensely physical, intensely skilled trade. A riveting team typically consisted of 4 men: a heater, who heated the rivets in a small furnace until they were glowing orange, a holder-on, who held one end of the rivet steady with a heavy tool, and 2 riveters, who worked in alternating blows, driving the rivet home with heavy hammers in a precise, rhythmic pattern that had to be perfectly coordinated to be effective. The sound of a large shipyard at work, the continuous, overlapping thunder of hundreds of riveting teams working simultaneously, was one of the defining sounds of the industrial age, a sound so intense that prolonged exposure to it caused permanent hearing loss in many of the men who worked there. The riveters on Titanic drove approximately 3 million rivets over the course of the ship's construction, each one a small steel rod that, when properly installed, created a joint of remarkable strength and reliability. 3 million rivets, each one the product of skilled hands, each one a small contribution to the enormous whole. The mathematics of it are staggering. 3 million individual acts of craftsmanship, each performed dozens or hundreds of times a day by men who had spent years learning to do this work, who had grown up in the shadow of the shipyard, who carried in their bodies the particular knowledge of their trade. But the riveters were only the most visible of the dozens of different trades involved in constructing the ship. There were platers, who shaped the enormous steel hull plates to the precise curves required by the design, a process that required the plates to be heated in furnaces and then worked on enormous machines that bent them to the correct shape, a shape that might differ from plate to plate, since the hull of a ship is a complex curved surface rather than a simple cylinder or box. There were caulkers, who made the joints between hull plates watertight by driving a bead of material into the seam and compressing it to form a seal. There were angle iron smiths and joiners and painters and electricians and plumbers and engineers, a small army of specialists, each performing their particular part of the operation that would eventually produce a ship. The scale of the construction effort can be grasped through a few statistics. Those statistics never quite capture the reality of what it meant to stand on the stocks at Queen's Island and watch this vessel taking shape. The steel in Titanic's hull weighed approximately 26,000 tons. The finished ship, when fully loaded with fuel and provisions and passengers and cargo, would displace just over 66,000 tons of water. The hull itself was 983 feet long, almost exactly a fifth of a mile, and 92 feet wide. The height from keel to boat deck was approximately 60 feet, while the 4 funnels added another 72 feet above the boat deck, so that the total height of the ship from the waterline to the tops of her funnels was comparable to a 12-story building. These numbers are impressive in themselves, but they don't quite convey the physical reality of standing next to Titanic as it was being built, of looking up at the hull plating rising above you like the wall of a particularly ambitious medieval castle, of hearing the endless thunder of the riveters and smelling the coal smoke and hot metal that permeated the entire yard, of watching the cranes, themselves impressive machines, capable of lifting many tons of steel, moving back and forth along the gantries, carrying components that would eventually become part of the largest moving object on Earth. The construction proceeded in stages, each one building on what had gone before. After the keel was laid, the frames, the curved structural members that gave the hull its shape, like the ribs of a whale, were erected along its length, their spacing precisely calculated to provide the structural integrity required by the design. Then the hull plating began, the great steel sheets fastened to the frames with thousands of rivets, one plate at a time, the hull rising and extending as the months passed. Then the decks were laid, and the interior compartmentalization began. the construction of the watertight bulkheads that divided the hull into 16 separate compartments, each one intended to remain watertight in the event of a breach in the hull. These watertight compartments were, in the thinking of the era, one of the key safety features of the ship. The compartmentalization system was designed so that Titanic could remain afloat with any two of its compartments flooded or with the first four compartments flooded simultaneously. The designers had even, in their calculations, considered what would happen if more than four compartments flooded, though they had concluded, based on careful analysis, that the scenarios in which this could occur were so extreme and so unlikely that they did not require detailed consideration. The ship was designed to survive almost anything the ocean could throw at it. The designers were confident of this. The calculations supported this confidence. And confidence, in the Edwardian age, was not merely a feeling. It was a professional obligation. The question of the ship's safety had come up repeatedly during the design process, and one aspect of it had produced a result that would later seem extraordinary in retrospect. The question was lifeboats. How many lifeboats should a ship of this size carry? The regulations governing British merchant shipping required, for a ship of Titanic's tonnage, a minimum of 16 lifeboats. Andrew's design incorporated 16 standard wooden lifeboats arranged along the boat deck in pairs, plus 4 of a newer type called Engelhart collapsible lifeboats. This gave the ship a total lifeboat capacity of approximately 1,200 people. The problem, which will haunt this story until its very end, was that Titanic was designed to carry over 2,200 people. The lifeboats could not, therefore, accommodate everyone on board, even if they were fully loaded, which, in practice, they almost never were, given the difficulties of loading lifeboats quickly and efficiently in any kind of emergency. The gap between capacity and provision was not secret. It was known to Andrews, known to Peary, known to White Star's management. And yet it did not produce alarm, did not prompt a redesign, did not cause anyone to insist on additional lifeboats. Because the underlying assumption, an assumption so deeply embedded in the thinking of the era that it barely rose to the level of conscious consideration, was that the ship would not sink. The compartmentalization system, the double bottom, the watertight doors that could be closed remotely from the bridge, these safeguards were so comprehensive and so carefully designed that the scenario of a ship like Titanic actually going to the bottom was considered so remote as to be, for practical purposes, impossible. This was not carelessness. This was not negligence, at least not of the simple, straightforward kind. This was something more complicated and more interesting than either of those things. This was the particular form of blindness that afflicts people who are very good at what they do, who have thought long and carefully about the problems in front of them, and who have arrived at a level of confidence in their solutions that makes the consideration of failure seem almost like a kind of disloyalty, a failure of nerve, an admission of inadequacy that they would rather not make and that the evidence, as they understood it, did not require them to make. Meanwhile, in the months and years while Titanic was taking shape on the stocks, the world outside the shipyard was following its progress with keen interest. The shipbuilding press reported on the construction in considerable technical detail. The weight of steel used, the power of the propulsion machinery, the dimensions of the watertight compartments. The general press reported in somewhat more populist terms, marveling at the scale of the enterprise and making liberal use of superlatives. Politicians from Belfast and from Westminster visited the yard and made speeches about the triumph of British industry. Ministers of Commerce and Trade cited the Olympic-class ships as evidence of Britain's enduring industrial supremacy. Ordinary citizens, who had followed the progress of the ship through photographs in their newspapers and could see from the road or from the water the growing silhouette of the hull against the Belfast sky, felt the pride of proximity, the particular pleasure of being able to say that this thing, this astonishing thing, was being made here, by people from here, by hands that might belong to your neighbor or your brother or your father. The launch of the hull on the 31st of May 1911 was the moment at which all of this pride and all of this anticipation found its public expression. A launch in the shipbuilding tradition was the point at which the completed hull, unfinished still, without its fittings and furnishings and machinery, but recognizable as a ship, wearing its shape if not yet its substance, was released from the stocks and allowed to slide into the water for the first time. It was the moment at which the vessel committed itself to its element, the moment at which the accumulated months of labor produced their most dramatic and visible result. The crowds that gathered at Queen's Island on that May morning were enormous. Over 100,000 people, by various estimates, had come to watch. They crowded the quays and the jetties and every available vantage point around the lock. They came by train and by tram and on foot, having traveled in some cases considerable distances to be present for the occasion. Local businesses had declared the day a holiday. School children had been given the morning off. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival, with vendors selling food and drink and mementos along the approaches to the yard. The ceremony itself was brief by later standards. There was no traditional bottle of champagne broken against the hull, as White Star did not perform such christenings. But the moment when the massive hull began to move, began its stately, inevitable slide toward the water, was electrifying. The crowd fell momentarily silent as the movement began, as though collective breath had been held, and then erupted into cheering and applause as the hull gathered speed and drove into the water of the lock with a tremendous crash and a wave that sent spray flying across the assembled dignitaries. The sound of the crowds, mixed with the noise of the water and the deep vibration of the hull settling into its element, was something that those who witnessed it would describe for the rest of their lives. Among the dignitaries present was J. Bruce Ismay, who watched the launch with a satisfaction that was evident to those around him, but that he expressed, characteristically, with restraint. Ismay was a man who attracted complex reactions. He was the son of a founder and had inherited a great company, but he had also worked to prove himself worthy of that inheritance, had guided White Star through a period of enormous change, and had been the driving force behind the Olympic-class project from its inception. He was not universally liked. He could be cold, imperious, demanding in his standards, difficult in his personal manner, but he was respected, and on this day, with this achievement, the respect was freely given. Present also was Thomas Andrews, who had designed the ship now floating in the lock before him and who felt, watching it, the particular satisfaction of a craftsman who has made something difficult and made it well. Andrews was not a demonstrative man, not given to public displays of emotion, but those who knew him well could see in his face, on this day, something beyond professional satisfaction, something closer to wonder. After the launch, Titanic was moved to the fitting-out wharf, where the work of transforming the bare hull into a finished ship would continue for another year. The machinery had to be installed. The enormous reciprocating engines, each one 5 stories tall, each one capable of developing 15,000 indicated horsepower, along with the Parsons steam turbine that would supplement them, the 3-bladed wing propellers, and the 4-bladed center propeller that would drive the ship through the water, the boilers, 29 of them in total, arranged in 6 boiler rooms, each one burning coal at a rate of several hundred tons per day to produce the steam that drove everything. The interior had to be completed, the cabins fitted out, the public rooms decorated, the furniture and fixtures installed, the carpets laid, the curtains hung, the silverware polished, the kitchens equipped, the libraries stocked, the gymnasium furnished. The work of fitting out was in many ways as demanding as the work of construction, requiring an extraordinary coordination of craftsmen from dozens of different trades, many of them working simultaneously in spaces that were not yet complete, navigating around each other in corridors and staterooms that were still being built even as they were being furnished. The decorators and craftsmen who worked on Titanic's interiors were among the most skilled in Britain, recruited from firms that had worked on the finest hotels and private houses in the country. The carved oak panels for the first-class dining saloon were made by craftsmen in the joinery shops at the yard, working from designs that referenced the great English country houses of the 17th century. The elaborate plasterwork ceilings were cast by specialists in decorative plaster who had spent years learning their trade on the grand houses of the English aristocracy. The stained glass for the smoking room and other public spaces was produced by artisans whose training in this art went back generations. The result, as it gradually emerged during the months of fitting out, was extraordinary. Photographs taken aboard Titanic during this period, photographs that survive and that have been reproduced countless times, show spaces of genuine elegance, rooms that manage to be grand without being oppressive, comfortable without being bland, luxurious without being ostentatious. The grand staircase, with its carved oak and its ornate clock and its great dome of glass and iron admitting natural light from above, was exactly what it was intended to be, a space that made the person descending it feel, for a moment, that they inhabited a world of perfect civilization, a world in which all the rough edges had been smoothed away and all the discomforts had been eliminated, and all that remained was the pleasure of being alive in an age of such extraordinary achievement. But Titanic was not only a project of aesthetics and ambition. It was also a project of engineering, and in the final months of fitting out, the engineering work reached its most demanding phase. The sea trials, the tests of the ship's machinery and handling under actual conditions at sea, were conducted in Belfast Lough in early April of 1912, and they proceeded, for the most part, satisfactorily. The engines were run up to full power. The steering gear was tested. The anchoring equipment was exercised. Various maneuvers were performed. The results were encouraging. There was a moment during the sea trials when Thomas Andrews stood on the bridge of the ship he had designed and watched Belfast recede behind them as Titanic moved out into the waters of the loch, and the feeling that came over him was one that he would later describe in a letter to his wife. It was not triumph, exactly. It was something quieter than triumph, a deep, almost aching satisfaction, the satisfaction of a craftsman who has spent years on a piece of work and who can now see it complete, can see it doing what it was made to do, can measure the distance between what was imagined and what has been achieved and find that the distance is small, that the reality is close to the vision. Andrews was meticulous. He was thorough. During those days of final preparation before the ship was delivered to White Star and set out on its maiden voyage, he walked every deck, inspected every cabin, made long lists of deficiencies and adjustments that still needed to be made, communicated with the various departments responsible for addressing them. Many of the items on his list were trivial: a coat hook in the wrong position, a piece of trim that had been fitted slightly off-center, a cabin that needed an extra mirror. But Andrews took them seriously. He took everything seriously. He understood, as few people of his era fully understood, that a ship was only as good as its details, that the experience of a passenger was shaped not just by the grandeur of the public rooms, but by the thousand small things that the design either got right or got wrong. The world, meanwhile, was continuing to watch. As the date of the maiden voyage approached, the newspapers of Britain and America devoted increasing space to Titanic, to its scale, its luxury, its engineering achievements, the passenger list that was beginning to take shape. And that passenger list was, in itself, a remarkable document of the age. The first-class passenger manifest read like a directory of the Anglo-American upper classes. It included John Jacob Astor IV, arguably the wealthiest man in the United States. He was traveling with his new wife, Madeline, 19 years old and 5 months pregnant, whom he had married the previous year following a divorce that had scandalized New York society. It included Benjamin Guggenheim, another heir to one of America's great industrial fortunes, traveling in the company of his valet and his secretary and, somewhat less officially, his French mistress. It included Margaret Brown, later and somewhat inaccurately known to history as the unsinkable Molly Brown, a self-made woman from the American West who had risen from poverty through the discovery of gold on her family's Colorado mining claim and who had used that wealth to build for herself a position in the highest levels of Denver and New York society. It included Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy, Lady Duff Gordon, a celebrated fashion designer who dressed the most prominent women in Britain and America under the professional name Lucille. It included the journalist and peace activist W.T. Stead, one of the most prominent and controversial figures in British public life, a man who had spent decades campaigning for causes ranging from workers' rights to international arbitration and who had, rather remarkably, written 2 stories in the 1890s that described fictional ocean liner disasters on the North Atlantic with details that would later seem prophetic. It included Archibald Butt, military aide to President William Howard Taft, who had written to a friend before boarding that he felt an unaccountable reluctance about the voyage, that something in the atmosphere of preparation felt to him less like the beginning of an adventure than like the end of something. It included the artist Francis Millet, heading back to America after months in Rome. It included the theatrical producer Henry B. Harris and his wife Irene. It included dozens of others, businessmen and socialites and professionals and tourists, each with their own reasons for traveling, their own histories, their own hopes for the journey ahead. In second class, there were clergymen and professors and engineers and merchants and their families, people of the comfortable professional middle class who were traveling for business or pleasure or to visit relatives, people whose names were not known to the press, but whose lives were no less real and no less consequential for that. There was a young assistant professor of classics from Brown University named Lawrence Beasley, traveling alone, who would later write one of the most careful and valuable first-person accounts of the events of the voyage. There was the Reverend John Harper, a Scottish Baptist minister traveling to take up a preaching engagement in Chicago, who was bringing with him his young daughter and a niece, who were to spend the summer in Canada with relatives. And in third class, there were hundreds of emigrants from dozens of countries, carrying in their luggage the sum total of what they had decided to take with them into the new world that waited on the far side of the Atlantic. There were families, a mother and 5 children emigrating to join a father who had already crossed and found work and built a small foundation that the family would now expand together. There were young men traveling alone, agricultural laborers and tradesmen and factory workers who had heard that America offered wages undreamed of in their home villages and who were betting their futures on the truth of that rumor. There were young women, in some cases very young women, traveling to take up positions in domestic service, to work as maids and cooks and chambermaids in the households of prosperous Americans who preferred European servants. Among the third-class passengers were people who had already made the crossing once and who were returning, perhaps with savings accumulated over years of work in America, perhaps with new skills and new confidence and new plans. There were people who had sold everything they owned to pay for the ticket, the farm, the furniture, the equipment of a trade, because they had concluded, after long deliberation, that the old world held nothing for them and that the new world was their only chance. There were people who were afraid and people who were excited and people who were both, and all of them were coming together on this particular ship, at this particular moment, for reasons as varied and particular and human as the lives they were living. The crew who would serve all of these passengers, who would cook their food and serve their meals and clean their cabins and maintain the engines and navigate the ship, and, in a dozen other ways, make the experience of ocean travel possible, were as varied as the passengers, though their variety was less visible to the passengers than it was among themselves. The senior officers were men of considerable experience, many of them veterans of the Atlantic run who had spent years aboard White Star ships, and who wore their rank and their knowledge with the particular dignity of professionals who understand their trade completely and have nothing to prove. The captain was Edward John Smith, 62 years old, known throughout the company and throughout the maritime world as a man of unimpeachable competence and an almost talismanic steadiness. Smith had spent his entire career at sea, had commanded White Star ships for decades, had been given the captaincy of every major new vessel the company launched as both an honor and a practical acknowledgement of his abilities. Olympic had been his ship, and now Titanic was his ship, and this was to be his last voyage before retirement, a fact that had been reported in the newspapers, and that gave the voyage, for those who knew of it, an additional dimension of significance, a sense of conclusion, of a distinguished career coming to its dignified close. Smith was a man who inspired genuine affection in the people who served under him. He was not cold or remote in the way that authority sometimes makes men cold or remote. He was warm, approachable, attentive to his officers and his crew in a way that earned him loyalty rather than mere compliance. He had crossed the Atlantic more times than he could accurately count, had navigated through fog and storms and ice, had handled every kind of situation the ocean could produce, and he carried all of that experience with a lightness that younger officers found reassuring, a lightness that said, without words, that whatever happened, he had seen something like it before and knew what to do. Southampton in April of 1912 was a city in a state of considerable excitement. The arrival of Titanic, which had come from Belfast via a brief stop at Liverpool, had drawn enormous crowds to the waterfront. The ship dominated the harbor, dwarfing everything around it, visible from miles away, an object of such extraordinary scale that people simply came to look at it, to stand on the docks and try to comprehend it, to take photographs and send postcards and write letters to relatives in other parts of the country describing what they had seen. The loading of a great ocean liner before departure was a complex and carefully choreographed operation. Provisions had to be brought aboard, tons of food and drink, everything from fine wines and cigars for the first-class passengers to the simple staples that would feed the crew. Coal had to be bunkered, a process that, in 1912, involved not the simple pumping of fuel oil, but the physical loading of hundreds of tons of coal into the ship's bunkers by teams of men working with shovels and tubs and conveyor systems, a process that left every surface near the operation coated with black dust. Baggage had to be loaded. The trunks and cases of the first-class passengers were often enormous, containing the wardrobes and personal effects of people who expected to change clothes several times a day and who had enough money to own and to travel with everything they might conceivably need. There were also, in those final days, people who had planned to sail and did not. A coal strike earlier in the spring had disrupted travel schedules across Britain, and some passengers who had originally booked on other ships had transferred to Titanic. Others had made the reverse journey, transferring away from Titanic to other vessels for reasons that ranged from schedule changes to business obligations to simple intuition. J.P. Morgan, the American financier who was perhaps the most powerful capitalist in the world, whose company International Mercantile Marine controlled both White Star and several other major shipping lines, had been booked to sail on Titanic but had canceled at the last minute, citing illness and the advice of his doctors. He spent the spring instead at a spa in France, where his health appeared to recover rapidly. The morning of the 10th of April, 1912. Southampton is bright and cold, the kind of April morning that promises spring but hasn't quite delivered it yet, with a light breeze off the water and the smell of salt and coal smoke hanging over the docks. Along the White Star Pier, Titanic rises against the morning sky, her four funnels painted in the company's colors, buff yellow topped with black, her hull a gleaming expanse of black and white, her decks lined with figures already moving about their business as the final preparations for departure are made. The passengers have been arriving since early in the morning, the first class in their motor cars and their hired carriages, the second class and third class by train, an enormous, continuous human stream flowing along the pier and up the gangways and into the ship's interior, where stewards and stewardesses stand ready to guide them to their cabins and answer their questions and attend to their immediate needs. The excitement is tangible, the excitement of beginning a journey, of committing oneself to an adventure, of leaving behind the familiar and moving toward the unknown. There is noise and movement and the occasional burst of laughter and the sound of children and the distant whistle of a departing train, and, beneath all of it, the low, steady pulse of the ship's engines already running, already warming, already preparing for the work ahead. Thomas Andrews is aboard, as he had been for the sea trials and as he would be for the entire voyage, accompanying the ship in his capacity as Harland and Wolff's representative, ready to address any technical issues that might arise during the maiden voyage, walking the ship each day with his notebook and his pencil, making his lists of adjustments. He finds the ship, in this first hour of its voyage as a passenger vessel, a source of genuine pride and genuine pleasure. He has spent years of his life on this project, and now it is here, and it is real, and it is, by any objective measure, magnificent. At noon, the great ship begins to move. The tugs, 6 of them, small and powerful and pugnacious, dwarfed by the vessel they are helping to guide, take up their lines and begin the delicate work of maneuvering Titanic away from the dock and into the main channel of the River Test. The process is slow and careful, as such processes must be with a ship of this size, and the crowds on the dock and the quayside watch in silence that is somehow more expressive than any noise could be, a silence of pure attention, of the human capacity to recognize when something worth watching is happening. And then, as Titanic clears the dock and enters the river, something unexpected happens. The enormous displacement of water created by the great ship's passage sucks in 2 vessels moored nearby with such force that their mooring lines snap under the strain, and one of the ships, the New York, a smaller ocean liner, begins to swing toward Titanic with increasing speed, her stern drawing closer and closer to the larger ship's hull in a way that produces shouts from observers and quick action from the tugs and from Captain Smith on the bridge. The collision is averted, just, and the New York is secured by her own tugs and returned to her berth. The incident lasts only a few minutes and causes no damage. But it is noted by those who observe it, noted and filed away in the memory in the way that close calls are always filed away, with a mixture of relief and residual unease, with the particular awareness of how close things can come to going very wrong. The near miss is forgotten quickly in the excitement of departure. The ship moves down the Test and out into Southampton water and then into the Solent, the narrow channel between the mainland and the Isle of Wight, and the passengers crowd to the rails to watch the English landscape passing. The day is still bright and clear. The ship moves through the water with a solidity, a purposefulness, a sense of contained power that is deeply reassuring to those aboard it. This ship, the passengers feel, and most of the crew feel too, is exactly what it was said to be. It is the right vessel. It is the vessel you want to be on, crossing the Atlantic in April of 1912. Titanic makes 2 more stops before heading out into the open Atlantic. Cherbourg, on the northern coast of France, where additional passengers come aboard, including John Jacob Astor and his wife, and Benjamin Guggenheim, and a number of other wealthy Americans who have spent the winter in Europe, and then Queenstown, on the southern coast of Ireland, where the last of the emigrants come aboard. Hundreds of men and women and children who have traveled by train and by cart and on foot too, reach the port, who have said their goodbyes to the green fields and gray skies of Ireland, who are leaving for the last time, most of them for the last time, the country where they were born. At Queenstown, a young postal worker named John Coffey, who has been working aboard as a mail handler, jumps ship and stays behind. He will later be asked, repeatedly, why he made that decision, why he chose to leave Titanic at Queenstown rather than completing the crossing. He will say, with the simplicity that is sometimes the only available response to such questions, that he simply felt it was time to go home. The rest of them stay. The rest of them are aboard when the last tender leaves the ship's side and Titanic turns its bow toward the open Atlantic, when the coast of Ireland disappears astern and the great expanse of the Western Ocean opens before it. The April sea is calm. The sky is clear. The ship is alive with the sounds and smells and textures of a great enterprise in motion. The smell of cooking from the kitchens, the sound of music from the first-class reception rooms, the clatter of tableware being laid for dinner, the throb of the engines far below. The crossing has begun. The first days at sea are, by all accounts, extraordinary. The weather holds fair and clear. The seas are moderate. The ship performs exactly as its designers intended. The passengers settle into the rhythms of shipboard life. The meals in the dining rooms, the walks on the promenade decks, the games and conversations and social rituals of a floating community finding its temporary shape. The first class, in their palatial staterooms and their elegant public rooms, engage in the elaborate social performance that their class required of them at all times and all places, even at sea, perhaps especially at sea. They dress for dinner in the finest clothes they own. They drink fine wines and eat exquisite food. They sit in the smoking room after dinner and talk about business and politics and the state of the world. The second-class passengers have their own parallel world of dinners and conversations and card games and deck walks, comfortable and pleasant, if less ceremonial than what is happening 1 or 2 decks above them. The third-class passengers, in the lower decks, have their own community, their own social life organized around the common rooms and the open spaces of the lower decks, their own music and their own conversations in a dozen languages, their own particular mixture of excitement and apprehension and hope. For Thomas Andrews, the first days of the voyage are busy ones. He is everywhere on the ship, moving from deck to deck, from forward to aft, checking and observing and noting. He finds a problem with the temperature regulation in some of the cabins, too warm in some, too cool in others, and leaves instructions for the engineering department to investigate. He discovers that some of the first-class doors are sticking slightly, a consequence, probably, of the wood having absorbed moisture since the ship entered service, and arranges for carpenters to plane them down. He notes a concern about the height of the hat hooks in certain cabins, a minor issue, but one that will be addressed before the next voyage. His notebook fills with small observations, small corrections, small improvements. The ship, in Andrew's estimation, is doing well. The ship is doing very well indeed. Captain Smith, on the bridge, has received several ice warnings from other ships in the area, warnings that ice has been reported at various positions in the North Atlantic, carried south by the unusually cold winter of 1911-12. These warnings are routine. Ice in the North Atlantic in April is expected, known, accounted for. Smith has navigated through ice-prone areas many times in his career. The standard procedure, maintaining speed, keeping good watch, altering course if ice is sighted, is well established and well understood, and there is no particular alarm associated with the reports. Sunday the 14th of April dawns clear and bitterly cold. The temperature has been falling for hours. The sea is as flat as Smith has ever seen it, an almost mirror-like calm that is unusual for the North Atlantic at this time of year. More ice warnings come in during the day, relayed by the wireless operators. The sun sets with extraordinary clarity, the horizon knife-sharp, the first stars appearing while the western sky is still pale. By evening, the temperature is below freezing. The ship moves through the dark at 22.5 knots, faster than it has traveled on any other night of the voyage. The passengers are at dinner, at cards, at music, at bed. The crew are at their stations. The lookouts in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, scan the darkness ahead, relying on their eyes because, owing to an administrative oversight before departure, the binoculars intended for the crow's nest were not aboard. They rely on their eyes, and on the stars, and on the absolute flat calm of the sea, looking for the one thing that they know is out there somewhere, the one thing that the dozens of messages in the wireless room have told them to be watching for. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet sees it, a shape in the darkness. He reaches for the crow's nest telephone and rings the bridge. 3 bells. And then his voice, calm as the sea around him. Iceberg, right ahead. The orders come from the bridge. Hard to starboard. Stop engines. Full astern. The wheel spins. The engines respond. The great ship, which has been moving through the dark at its steady, confident pace, begins, slowly, too slowly, to turn. The bow swings to port. The iceberg slides down the starboard side, 37 seconds after Fleet's warning, close enough that the lookouts could almost reach out and touch it. And then the ship is past it, and for a moment, one last moment of ordinary time, one last moment in which everything is still possible, it seems that all is well. But Thomas Andrews knows better. Thomas Andrews, called to the bridge by the captain, goes below to inspect the damage. He moves through the forward compartments with a flashlight, and he sees what the collision has done. The iceberg, submerged for most of its vast bulk below the waterline, has done its work not with a single dramatic blow, but with a series of small, insistent incisions along the hull plates, opening the seams between them, letting in the sea in dozens of small streams that are, individually, manageable, but collectively, inexorable. Andrews does the mathematics quickly, in his head. He knows the ship. He knows every compartment, every bulkhead, every calculation that went into the design. He knows the capacity of the pumps and the height of the watertight bulkheads and the rate at which the water is entering and the rate at which it will rise. He does the mathematics, and then he looks at Captain Smith and he says, with the quiet steadiness of a man who has spent his life telling the truth about things, even when the truth is terrible, the ship will sink in approximately an hour and a half, perhaps 2 hours. Smith looks at him. Are you sure? Andrews is sure. But before Andrews reaches that terrible certainty, before Fleet sees the shape in the dark, before the first wireless warnings come in and are weighed and considered and, in some measure, set aside, before all of that, there is a ship in the final light of a Sunday afternoon, moving west and south across a sea of extraordinary stillness, carrying its 2,000+ passengers and crew into a night of crystalline cold, and the world that all of them carry within them, the worlds of ambition and love and hope and memory and fear and joy that make up the sum of any human life. Those worlds are still intact, are still in motion, are still fully themselves. The immigrants in third class are thinking of America, of the relatives who will meet them at Ellis Island, of the neighborhoods they have heard about, of the jobs and the schools and the futures that are waiting for them somewhere in the enormous, mythological country that lies beyond the horizon. They are talking and singing and playing cards and trying to sleep in their bunks while their children breathe softly around them. They are afraid, and they are hopeful, and they are exhausted, and they are alive in the particular, irreducible way that only people who have risked everything to pursue a dream are alive. The wealthy in first class are finishing their dinners, retiring to the smoking room or the reception room, playing bridge or reading or writing letters that they plan to post from New York. Some of them are tired and will retire early. Some of them will stay up late, as people do on ships, seduced by the particular freedom of being at sea, the permission that distance from ordinary life seems to grant. They are thinking about their businesses and their families and their social obligations and their plans for New York. They are the richest people in the world, in many cases, and they are sitting in rooms of extraordinary luxury, and outside the great windows of those rooms the North Atlantic night is pressing in, cold and dark and absolute. Thomas Andrews, in his cabin, is writing to his wife Helen. He tells her about the ship, how well it is performing, how pleased he is with the interior, how gratifying it is to see the spaces he designed being used as he intended them to be used. He tells her about the passengers he has met, the conversations he has had, the small problems he has found and is fixing. He tells her he misses her and their daughter, Elizabeth, and that he will be glad to return home after the round trip. He is a man at the end of a long, difficult, ultimately successful project, and the tiredness in his words is the tiredness of accomplishment, the fatigue of a craftsman who has given everything to his work and can now see it complete. The ship beneath him is every ship he has ever designed, every choice he has ever made, every hour of work and thought and calculation that has occupied his professional life. It is the best thing he has ever done. He knows this, and in the knowledge there is a peace that runs beneath the tiredness, a deep and genuine peace. At this moment, this particular moment, in the late afternoon of Sunday the 14th of April, 1912, everything is still exactly what it was meant to be. The ship is doing what it was built to do. The passengers are doing what they came to do. The crew are doing what they were hired to do. The machinery is running. The kitchens are operating. The stewards are serving. The engines are turning. The propellers are driving the great hull through the flat, cold, darkening sea. The dream is intact. The dream is moving. The dream is alive. What comes next is part of a story that the whole world knows. But knowing how a story ends does not diminish its beginning. And the beginning of this story, the ambition that produced it, the ingenuity that shaped it, the human beings who built it and sailed it and hoped in it. That beginning has its own kind of magnificence, its own kind of meaning that is entirely independent of what followed. Because Titanic was not simply a ship that sank. It was, first and most completely, a dream. A dream of what human beings could build, of how far imagination and engineering and ambition could carry us, of what civilization was capable of when it directed all of its considerable powers toward the creation of something genuinely extraordinary. The dream was real. The ship was real. The people who dreamed it and built it and sailed it were real, and the fullness of their lives, the complexity of their hopes and their fears and their loves and their labors, deserves to be remembered and honored and held with the same care and the same attention that the more dramatic events of those final hours have always commanded. They built something magnificent. They were aboard something magnificent, moving through a night of stars toward a city that would change their lives. And for one moment more, one last, long, suspended moment before the ship meets the dark and the cold and the oldest force on earth, let them have that. Let them have the beauty of what they made and what they were and what they believed was possible. The ship moves on. The stars are very bright tonight. There is a particular quality to silence at sea that has no equivalent on land. It is not the absence of sound. The ocean is never silent. It breathes. It shifts. It speaks in a language older than any human tongue, in the low percussion of swells against steel, in the hiss of foam along a hull moving at speed, in the deep, almost subsonic thrum of engines that you feel more in the chest than hear with the ears. At sea, silence is a thing made of sound rather than deprived of it. It is the silence between heartbeats, the silence of a sleeping world. On the night of April 14th, 1912, that silence belonged to the North Atlantic, and threading through it, blazing through it, really, lit from stem to stern, pouring warmth and music and the smell of roasting meat and fresh-cut flowers into a darkness that had known nothing but wind and stars for 1,000 years, was the RMS Titanic. She was 4 days out of Southampton. She was making 22.5 knots. She was the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands, and she was alive in a way that no description fully captures, because she was alive with the lives of 2,224 people, each of whom carried inside them an entire universe of memory and longing and unfinished business and secret hope. Each of whom had, in their own way, a reason to reach New York. Each of whom was, on this particular Sunday evening, doing something utterly ordinary. That is what we must understand first, before the ice, before the lifeboats, before the names carved into memorial walls in 100 cities around the world. We must understand the ordinary. We must go aboard. The ship herself. She was 882 feet long. Say that again slowly. 882 feet. From her bow to her stern, you could lay the Washington Monument end to end and still have room left over. You could drop 11 London double-decker buses nose to tail along her keel. She displaced 46,328 tons. Her reciprocating engines, two of them, each the size of a terraced house, drove a combined 29 boilers, 159 furnaces, 29,000 tons of coal capacity. She had a rudder that weighed 100 tons. Her anchors weighed 15.5 tons each. These numbers, stacked one atop the other, begin to feel almost absurd. They feel boastful, which is perhaps why White Star Line was careful, in its advertising, to speak of size only as a precondition of something else, of safety, of luxury, of stability. The point of the Titanic was not that she was vast. The point was that her vastness had been turned, like a craftsman turns raw timber, into something of exquisite and purposeful refinement. She had a swimming bath. She had a squash court. She had a gymnasium fitted with rowing machines and a mechanical camel and a stationary bicycle and an electric horse. She had a Turkish bath suite, tiled in brilliant blue-green ceramics from which hot steam breathed hour after hour. She had a veranda cafe where potted palms stood in corners and wicker chairs invited passengers to imagine themselves on the Riviera. She had a barber's shop. She had a darkroom for photographers. She had a printing press that produced a daily newspaper, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, so that passengers need not feel the world had forgotten them simply because they were 3 days from any coast. She had 4 elevators, the first ever fitted to an ocean liner, so that older passengers and those unsteady on their legs need not climb the great staircases. She had a post office, staffed by 5 postal clerks who sorted letters on crossing after crossing with the same cheerful efficiency as their counterparts in London or New York. She had a bakery that operated around the clock, filling the lower decks with the smell of bread at 3 in the morning. She had a hospital with a surgery, attended by 2 doctors, Dr. William O'Loughlin, the ship's 62-year-old surgeon who had been making Atlantic crossings since before some of the passengers were born, and Dr. John Simpson, the assistant surgeon, 27 years old and sharp-eyed, and full of the particular confidence of a young man who has not yet seen enough of the world to be humbled by it. She had, in short, everything. That was the point of her. She was not a ship so much as a proposition. She proposed that the Atlantic Ocean, that vast, treacherous, gray-green wilderness that had swallowed so many ships and so many people across the centuries of crossing, could be made irrelevant. She proposed that wealth and engineering, properly applied, could insulate human beings from the world's indifference so completely that they might cross the Atlantic as comfortably as they might cross a drawing room. On the night of April 14, 1912, nobody aboard her seriously doubted that the proposition was true. First class, the world above. Begin at the top. The first-class accommodation of the Titanic occupied the B and C decks amidships, the sweetest, steadiest section of the ship, furthest from the bow's pitching and the stern's vibration. Here the hallways were wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, even if one was carrying luggage. The carpet beneath your feet was thick enough to silence footsteps. The lighting, a warm, amber electric glow from sconces designed to mimic gas flame, turned every corridor into something approaching an anteroom of a great country house. The staterooms ranged from the simply luxurious to the almost aggressively opulent. The 2 promenade suites on B deck, the most expensive accommodation aboard, at prices that began at £870 for the crossing, equivalent to roughly £90,000 today, came with their own private promenade decks, paneled sitting rooms, separate bedrooms, dressing rooms, and bathrooms lined in white marble veined with gray. They had been designed for the very highest echelon of Edwardian society, for men who owned coal mines and steel mills and railroad lines, for women who changed their dresses 4 times a day and kept personal maids to manage the complexity of their wardrobes. On this crossing, the most expensive suites were occupied by J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, 52 years old, a tall, lean man with a clipped mustache and the slightly haunted air of someone who knows the world expects more from him than it has yet received, and by the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, 41, from Belfast, the man who had been present at every rivet, who knew the Titanic the way a sculptor knows a beloved statue, who had spent the crossing walking her decks with a notebook, cataloging her minor imperfections with the quiet obsessiveness of a man who cannot help but see room for improvement even in his masterwork. They were, in many ways, two very different men. Ismay was the commercial mind, the man who had pushed for the Olympic-class ships, who had argued that White Star needed to compete with Cunard's Mauretania and Lusitania not on speed, but on scale and comfort. Andrews was the craftsman, the man who had spent years at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, who had come up through the drawing offices and the construction floors, who understood stress loads and watertight compartments and the physics of buoyancy with an intimacy that his superior could never quite match. They were both, in their own ways, invested in this ship beyond what any profit margin could express. She was, for each of them, something close to a statement of identity. Beyond their suites, the first-class section of the Titanic contained hundreds of passengers whose names would, in the days that followed, become freighted with history. But on the evening of April 14th, they were simply people. They were eating. They were drinking. They were playing cards and smoking cigars and reading novels and arguing gently about politics and complaining about the cold. They were alive, and they were comfortable, and the night ahead of them held, as far as any of them could know, nothing more remarkable than a good night's sleep. The first-class dining saloon. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the first-class dining saloon on D-deck began to fill. It was the largest room aboard the ship, 114 feet long, broad and high-ceilinged, paneled in white Jacobean woodwork with carved alcoves and leaded windows that, during daylight hours, admitted a diffused Atlantic light. The tables were set with White Star-lined china, heavy, cream-colored porcelain rimmed with blue and gold, and real crystal glasses that caught the electric light and scattered it in small, bright pieces across the white linen tablecloths. There were flowers on every table, carnations and roses and ferns, shipped fresh from Southampton 3 days ago, and still holding color, still releasing the faint ghost of their fragrance against the smell of the dinner being prepared in the vast galley beyond the serving doors. The menu for the evening of April 14th would later become, in the imagination of posterity, one of the most famous menus in history. Not because it was extraordinary. By the standards of Edwardian fine dining, it was simply excellent, rather than spectacular, but because it became a kind of artifact of the last ordinary hours. It was 11 courses. It began with oysters, moved through consommé and salmon with mousseline sauce, through lamb with mint sauce and roast duckling with applesauce and sirloin of beef, through foie gras and celery, and Waldorf pudding and French ice cream, and cheese and fresh fruit, accompanied by wines that had been carefully selected by the ship's wine steward. 11 courses. 2,224 people on a ship steaming at full speed across a sea of ice. Nobody ate 11 courses consciously thinking this is my last meal. That is the precise nature of dramatic irony, and it is also, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about the Titanic. The horror of what happened was not merely in the dying. It was in the completeness and ordinariness of the living that preceded it. The total absorption of 2,000 people in the perfectly mundane business of being alive. The question of whether the salmon was as good as it had been the night before, the minor social calculation of whether to accept another glass of Chablis, the pleasant weariness that comes from a day spent doing nothing in particular at sea. Among the diners that evening was Margaret Brown, known to history as the unsinkable Molly Brown, though nobody called her Molly to her face. 44 years old, from Colorado, the wife of a silver mining millionaire, ebullient and broad-shouldered and possessed of a laugh that could fill a room. She had been in Europe visiting her daughter and was returning to Denver for reasons that she had not fully explained even to herself. A restlessness, a need to be moving, the vague sense that she had been away long enough. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, 56, heir to the Guggenheim mining fortune, accompanied not by his wife, who had remained in New York with their children, but by his mistress, a French singer named Leontine Aubard, 24, dark-haired and vivid, and very much aware of her position in a social ecosystem that simultaneously depended upon and disapproved of women like her. There was Isidore Strauss, 67, co-owner of Macy's department store, and his wife Ida, 63, who had been married for 41 years and who were, by all accounts, one of those rare couples whose long marriage had deepened rather than eroded the fundamental warmth between them. They sat together at dinner every evening and could sometimes be seen holding hands while reading in their stateroom. And there is something about that particular detail, so quiet, so human, that makes the events of the next few hours almost unbearable to contemplate. There was John Jacob Astor IV, 33 years old, the wealthiest passenger aboard, worth something in the neighborhood of $87 million in 1912 money, a figure that resists easy translation into the present but might be understood as simply more money than almost anyone else in the world. He was accompanied by his new wife, Madeline, 18 years old and visibly pregnant. They had married the previous year after his divorce, causing a scandal that had driven them to spend a long honeymoon in Europe, partly to allow American society to calm itself before their return. He was a complicated man, inventor, author, soldier, and, beneath the patrician reserve that the fortune imposed upon him, possibly a person of some genuine depth that the fortune also made impossible to locate. There was Henry Sleeper Harper, with his wife and his Pekingese dog son Yatsen, and Lady Duff Gordon, Lucille, the fashion designer, who was traveling as Mr. and Mrs. Morgan in an attempt to avoid the particular kind of public attention that attached itself to celebrities on ocean liners. There was Colonel Archibald Gracie IV, 54, a military historian and inveterate socialite who had spent much of the day in the gymnasium and was consequently feeling extremely pleased with himself. There was Colonel John Weir. No, not a colonel at all, but determined to seem like one. And there was Thomas Andrews, dining quietly, still making notes. The smoking room, after dinner. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the first-class smoking room had become, as it did every night, the heart of a particular kind of masculine sociability. The room itself was designed to be the most unambiguously English space on the ship. Dark oak paneling, green leather upholstery, stained glass windows depicting classical ports, the particular warm fug of tobacco smoke and whiskey that signaled, to a certain kind of Edwardian man, that the world was being properly managed. It was the room where deals were made, or at least alluded to, where cards were played, where the conversation was permitted, by the tacit rules of its culture, to be somewhat more candid than it was at dinner. Tonight, a card game was in progress at a corner table. The players were intent but not desperate. This was a friendly game, punctuated by occasional laughter and the cheerful argument that good card players mistake for friendship. Cigar smoke rose toward the ceiling in slow, satisfied coils. Outside the stained glass, the Atlantic night was perfectly clear, perfectly cold, and moving backward past the ship at 22 knots. Several of the men in the smoking room that evening, card players, whiskey drinkers, casual conversationalists, were discussing the weather. Not because they were worried about it. Quite the reverse. It was the finest weather any of them could remember for an Atlantic crossing at this time of year. No fog, no rain, no rolling seas. The air so cold and clear that the stars, visible from the promenade deck, seemed impossibly close, implausibly bright. Someone mentioned that an acquaintance had told him that ice had been reported in the area. The observation was received with the mild interest that such things typically received in the smoking room. Noted, assessed, dismissed. The Titanic was unsinkable, wasn't she? And besides, the captain knew what he was doing. Men like Captain Smith didn't need amateurs from a smoking room telling them their business. The conversation moved on to the subject of New York, which served the same function on Atlantic crossings that Rome served for medieval pilgrims, a destination so freighted with significance that simply naming it reorganized the conversation. Plans were compared. Addresses were exchanged. Someone said they had a suite booked at the plaza. Someone else said they had dinner reservations at Delmonico's on Tuesday. The future was very concrete, very near, and apparently very certain. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Second class, the middle world. Move now through the ship. Down the corridors that connect the classes. Corridors that are, in the hierarchy of the Titanic, not merely passages but borders, each one a small assertion about where you stand in the world, down to second class. The second-class accommodation of the Titanic was, by the standards of any other liner then afloat, comparable to first class. This was a genuine achievement and something that White Star Line was quietly proud of. The Titanic offered, for a passage price of around £13, a level of comfort that would have been unimaginable to second-class passengers on older ships. The cabins were 2 to 4 berth rooms with real beds, not bunks, not hammocks, with white-painted walls and dark wood trim and proper wardrobes and wash basins with hot and cold running water. The dining saloon was handsome, if less grand than the first-class equivalent. Round tables with white cloths, good plain food served by efficient stewards, a wine list that was short but decent. The second-class library, with its mahogany bookcases and comfortable armchairs, was full on the evening of April 14th. People were reading. A few were writing letters, long, detailed letters that described the ship with the slightly stunned particularity of people who cannot quite believe their luck. Letters that would be mailed from New York and would arrive at addresses in England and Ireland and France several days after the writers themselves had become famous for reasons they could not have imagined. Among the second-class passengers that evening, the diversity of human purpose was striking. There were school teachers and Methodist ministers and young engineers and middle-class families emigrating to new lives in America. There were musicians, the 8-piece band, technically employees of the ship rather than passengers, but whose dining and social arrangements placed them firmly in the second-class social world, who had played for first class earlier in the evening and were now in their own accommodation, some playing cards, some reading, some simply resting their hands, which were, after all, their instruments. There was Lawrence Beasley, a 34-year-old science teacher from Dulwich College in London, traveling second class to visit his brother in Toronto. He was a precise, observant man, a scientist by temperament if not by current occupation, who had spent much of the crossing making careful notes about everything he saw. The color of the water at different times of day, the behavior of seabirds, the way the ship moved through light swells. He would survive the night ahead, and his account, written with the clarity and control of a man trained to observe, would become one of the most valuable documents in the entire literature of the disaster. There was Reverend John Harper, 39, Scottish, a Baptist minister, traveling with his 6-year-old daughter Nora and his niece Jessie Leach to take up a preaching engagement at Moody Church in Chicago. He was a broad-shouldered, passionate man, known for the intensity of his sermons and the warmth of his pastoral care. He had, by several accounts, spent part of the afternoon on deck reading his Bible in the cold air, apparently undisturbed by the temperature that had driven most other passengers inside. There was young Charlotte Collier, 29, traveling with her husband Harvey and their daughter Marjorie to a new life in Idaho, where Harvey planned to buy an apple farm. They had saved for 3 years to afford the passage. Charlotte was slight and a little pale. She had been ill recently, something to do with her lungs, and the doctor had suggested a warmer, drier climate. And she spent the evening of April 14th alternating between a book and a conversation with a young woman at the next table about the relative merits of various American states. There was a young man named Samuel Morley, 19, from Nottinghamshire, traveling to join a cousin in New York, who spent the evening teaching himself card tricks in the second-class lounge, to the amused tolerance of the other passengers there. He had been teaching himself the same 3 tricks since Southampton and was not yet fully proficient at any of them. These are not the people history tends to remember first when it speaks of the Titanic. But they are, in every sense that matters, the people who were there. The forward well deck and third class. Go further down and forward, and the ship changes again. Third class, called steerage, though the Titanic did not actually carry true steerage passengers, being too modern and too prestigious for the old open-plan sleeping decks, occupied the lower forward and aft sections of the ship, F and G decks, the areas furthest from the smooth midship comfort of first and second class, closest to the machinery, closest to the waterline, positioned where the pitching and rolling of the ship was most felt and the engine noise was most constant. The cabins here were small, 2-berth, 4-berth, 6 berth rooms of painted steel, with bunk beds bolted to the walls, and a small wash basin and a hook for your coat, and nothing else. There were no bookshelves, no wardrobes, no decorative panels. The beauty of the Titanic, celebrated so extensively in the first-class accommodation, was entirely absent here. What was here, in its place, was something more honest, and in its own way more remarkable. The concentrated human energy of people who have decided that wherever they are going is worth the journey they are making to get there. Third class on the Titanic carried 710 passengers. They came from England and Ireland and Sweden and Finland and Croatia and Syria and Lebanon and Norway, and wherever else the great rivers of emigration were running that year. They were miners and farm workers and shop assistants and lace makers and domestic servants, and people whose previous circumstances had been reduced, by economic necessity or political upheaval or private catastrophe, to a single urgent desire to begin again somewhere else. The third-class general room, the large common space at the aft of the ship, equipped with long tables and benches and a piano that someone was generally playing, was, on the evening of April 14th, very full and very noisy. This was the best kind of noise, the noise of people who have not yet been worn down by their journey, who are still in the first warmth of shared adventure. There was music, Irish fiddles and Swedish folk songs, and someone doing something experimental with a concertina. And there was dancing, because at the level of the human body, music and dancing are almost the same impulse, and on a ship at sea, in a room full of people who are all going to the same place for the same general reason, the impulse is very strong indeed. There was a young Irish girl named Kate Mullins, 19, from Offaly, with a broad, cheerful face and the kind of constitution that made dancing in a ship's common room feel like standing on solid ground. She had been dancing since 8 o'clock. She would dance until 10. At some point between then and midnight, she would go to her bunk and sleep the deep, purposeful sleep of someone who has used up exactly the right amount of the day's energy. There was a family of 3, a father, mother, and infant son, from Croatia, making their second attempt at immigration after the first had been cut short by illness. The father's name was Nikola. He spent the evening sitting slightly apart from the main crowd, watching the dancing with an expression of mild, tolerant observation, occasionally dipping his finger into his infant son's mouth when the child stirred on his wife's lap. He and his wife spoke no English. This fact, which the evening made irrelevant, would in the hours to come become a matter of profound consequence. There was a Syrian family, husband and wife and 4 children, ranging from 3 months to 7 years old, who had been traveling since late February, a journey so long and so difficult that the Titanic represented not luxury, but simply the final leg of an endurance that had required everything they had. They were going to relatives in Pennsylvania. The mother's name was Mariana. She was 26 years old. She had not slept properly since February. And threading through all of this, through the dancing and the card games and the sleeping children and the whispered conversations and the occasional flare-up of argument among men who had been cooped up together for 4 days, was the particular quality of third-class hope. It is a different thing from first-class hope. First-class hope is confident and specific. I will attend this dinner. I will finalize this business deal. I will spend August at my house in Newport. Third-class hope is broader, less certain, and in that uncertainty more courageous. I will find work. I will send money home. I will, eventually, in some form that I cannot yet precisely describe, make this worth it. It is not a lesser hope. It may, in fact, be a greater one. Section 2. The Crew. The Bridge. 470 miles south of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. 31 years, 11 months, and 14 days since the last great White Star liner had struck an iceberg in these same waters and sunk within minutes. Captain Edward John Smith stood on the bridge of the RMS Titanic and looked out into the night. He was 62 years old. He had been going to sea since he was 13. He had commanded White Star vessels for 32 years, and the Olympic-class ships for which the Titanic was the successor had been, in their scale and complexity, the crowning achievement of his career. This was to be his final voyage. He had made the announcement months before his retirement. A gentle, gradual declaration, the kind that experienced men make when they know that one more crossing is enough, that the sea has given them everything it can, and that the time has come to sit in a garden in Liverpool and let someone else have the worry of it. He was a solid, silver-bearded man, with the calm, slightly distracted expression of someone who has spent so long at sea that the ocean has become, to him, a kind of wallpaper, present, noted, familiar, rarely surprising. He was beloved by the wealthy passengers who sailed with him regularly. They requested him by name. They sent him wine at Christmas. They spoke of a Captain Smith crossing as a particular kind of assurance, and respected, if slightly feared, by his officers. He had an excellent record. The collision of the Olympic with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke the previous year had been the only significant incident of his career, and the inquiry had found it was not his fault. Tonight, he had attended the dinner held in his honor in the first-class dining saloon, a tradition on the first great crossing of a new ship, and had departed early, as he usually did. He did not drink. He rarely socialized beyond what courtesy required. He was a man of the bridge, not the dining saloon, and the bridge was where he went when the social obligations of command released him. He had received, during the course of the day, several ice warnings. We will return to these at length. For now, simply know that he had received them, had logged them, had been aware, as any experienced Atlantic captain in April would be aware, that this was the season when Labrador current ice drifted south into the shipping lanes, and that this particular spring had been unusually warm, sending an unusual volume of ice further south than in most years. He knew this. He knew it the way he knew everything about the North Atlantic, competently, professionally, without alarm. He went to bed at around 9:30 in the evening, leaving the bridge to his officers. The night watch was in capable hands. First Officer William Murdoch had the watch. He was 39 years old, a Scot from Dalbeattie, lean and dark-haired and precise in the way that first officers tend to be on large ships where precision is the primary professional virtue. He had been with White Star for 14 years. He was, by most accounts, an excellent officer, efficient, calm, quick-thinking. He had an ambition that was currently in some tension with his position. He wanted a command of his own. He had been passed over once, and the passing over had stung him in ways he did not discuss. He had a fiancée in Liverpool, a woman named Ada Banks, who wrote him letters on the crossings that he kept in a bundle in his cabin, tied with a piece of cord. He was standing at the bridge windows now, watching the sea. The sea was absolutely flat. This was unusual for the North Atlantic in April. Unusual enough that officers who had been making crossings for years would later describe it as the calmest night they had ever seen in these waters. There were no swells. There were no waves of any significance. The ocean's surface was, in the language of seamanship, flat calm, which means something very specific. It means that the horizon is a hard, clear line and the stars reflect on the water and the world seems to be resting. It is beautiful in a stark and functional way. It is also, for reasons that Murdoch may or may not have been fully considering at this hour, problematic. Because a flat calm sea does not break on the base of an iceberg. And if the sea does not break on the base of an iceberg in a flat calm night is significantly harder to see. There is no white foam around its base, no phosphorescent surge, just the dark shape against the dark water against the dark sky, growing gradually, slowly, barely visibly larger as the ship bearing down on it at 22 knots closes the distance between them. In the crow's nest, 40 feet above the bridge deck, two lookouts sat in the dark. Their names were Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. Fleet was 24. Lee was 26. They had come on watch at 10 o'clock, relieving the previous watch, and now they sat in the crow's nest with the cold Atlantic wind coming over the bow and finding its way inside their coats, staring into the dark ahead of the ship. Their job was simple and ancient and, on a night like this, profoundly boring. Look at the horizon. Look for anything that shouldn't be there. Report it. They had no binoculars. This fact, which will become, in the reconstruction of the night's events, one of the most debated details in the entire history of the disaster, was not an oversight or a negligence. It was a circumstance. The binoculars that had been stored in the crow's nest locker on the Titanic's sea trials had been removed before departure from Southampton and had not been replaced, and the secondary pair that was intended for the crow's nest had been locked in a storage room whose key belonged to an officer who had been replaced at the last minute and who had inadvertently taken the key with him when he disembarked. The lookouts had requested binoculars at the start of the voyage. They had been told that the matter was being looked into. The matter had not been resolved. Fleet and Lee sat in their nest and looked at the dark sea with their naked eyes. Ahead of them, in the dark, at some point still beyond the range of resolution, still just the dark of the dark, something was there. The engine rooms and boiler rooms. Go down now. Down through the decks, through the floors and the ceilings and the service corridors, through the layers of the ship. Go down until you hear the sound change, until the soft domestic hum of the upper decks, conversation, piano music, the clink of glasses, is replaced by something more fundamental, more insistent, more ancient, until the ship ceases to be a hotel and becomes, in the most literal sense, a machine. The engine rooms of the Titanic occupied the lower depths of the ship amidships, accessed by ladders and companionways from the deck above, and they were, in the words of nearly everyone who ever entered them, astonishing. Two reciprocating steam engines, each one a cathedral of iron and brass, 3 stories high, their connecting rods moving in the slow, powerful rhythms of colossal pistons, drove the 2 outboard propellers. Between them, a Parsons turbine, the most advanced propulsion technology then available, using steam exhausted from the reciprocating engines to drive a third, central propeller, completed the propulsion system. The 3 propellers together could move 46,000 tons of ship at a top speed of roughly 24 knots. They were moving at 22.5 knots tonight. The engine room was lit by powerful electric arc lamps that threw everything in a high contrast. White light and black shadow, the glittering brass of instrument gauges, the dark gray of the engines themselves, the orange glow where maintenance panels were open and the heat inside them was visible. The sound was extraordinary. Not a roar, not exactly, but something more complex and rhythmic, a vast mechanical heartbeat that you could feel in your sternum and your feet and the base of your skull. It was the sound of a system working at the edge of its capacity, and it was, to the men who worked in it every day, as familiar and unremarkable as birdsong. The engineers were largely invisible to the passengers. This was by design. The machinery spaces of the Titanic were accessed by their own companionways, serviced by their own mess rooms, managed by their own chain of command, but it also reflected something more fundamental about the hierarchy of the ship. The engine room was where the work was, and the work was not for the passengers to see. There were 36 engineers aboard the Titanic. Their chief was Joseph Bell, who was 52 and who had been working marine steam engines since before electricity was common, and who had a way of listening to the engines that was less about hearing and more about feeling, a sort of whole-body attentiveness that came from 30 years of learning what a healthy engine sounded like and what one about to develop a problem sounded like. Below the engine rooms, further forward, the boiler rooms ran the length of the ship in 6 separate watertight compartments. Each boiler room contained a bank of double-ended boilers, each one a massive cylinder of riveted steel in which coal was burned to produce steam. The stokers, firemen, in the language of the ship, worked in 4-hour shifts, moving coal from the bunkers to the furnace doors with wide, flat shovels, maintaining the fire and the pressure and the temperature within the parameters that the engineering department required. It was the hardest, dirtiest, hottest work on the ship. The firemen lived in their own world, separate from the stewards and the officers and the musicians, a world of coal dust and shovels and the orange glow of furnace doors and the almost unbearable heat in summer, and even in April in the North Atlantic. The heat of the boiler rooms was such that men worked in minimal clothing and sweated continually. They communicated by gesture and necessity rather than conversation. The engine room noise made sustained speech difficult, and they shared a particular kind of camaraderie that comes from work that demands constant physical commitment and offers no glamour whatsoever. Their names do not appear in the newspapers. The newspapers, in the days that followed the disaster, would be full of the first-class passengers, the millionaires, the names that the readers recognized. The firemen of the Titanic, men named John Thompson and William Small and Frederick Barrett and Thomas Dillon, are mostly known, if at all, by their occupations rather than their stories. But they were there, feeding the furnaces that were driving the ship at 22.5 knots through the cold April night. And what happened in the hours ahead would happen to them as completely and as finally as it happened to anyone in the first-class smoking room. The wireless room. At the forward end of the boat deck, one deck above the bridge, in a small room that smelled of heated electronics, and something faintly metallic, the smell of radio waves, which is partly the smell of ozone generated by the spark gap transmitter. Two young men were working. Their names were John George Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Phillips was 25. Bride was 22. They were employed not by White Star Line, but by the Marconi Company, which had the contract to operate the wireless equipment aboard the Great Ocean liners. And their first responsibility was not to the officers of the ship, but to the passengers, specifically, to the paying passengers who wished to send telegrams. Wireless telegraphy was, in 1912, still a novelty sufficiently new that people felt a particular pleasure in using it. The pleasure of a technology that seems to compress distance, that allows a message to travel from the middle of an ocean to a London office in the time it takes to transmit it. First-class passengers sent telegrams home, sent telegrams ahead to New York hotels, sent telegrams to their stockbrokers with last-minute instructions. The traffic was constant. Phillips was the senior operator. He was a thin, intent young man, the sort who wore his concentration like a piece of clothing, whose face when he was working at the Morse key had the absorbed quality of a musician in performance. He had been at sea with Marconi for several years and was efficient and fast. His hand on the key had the automatic fluency of long practice, and he could receive and transmit at speeds that junior operators found difficult to match. Bride was newer, younger, and wore his enthusiasm more visibly. He was interested in everything about the ship, the machinery, the passengers, the radio traffic, the strange intimacy of the wireless world, in which operators on ships scattered across the ocean communicated with each other in a language of dots and dashes that was, in its own way, its own kind of community. The wireless equipment on the Titanic was among the most powerful then fitted to any ship. A 5-kilowatt set with a range of approximately 2,000 miles under good atmospheric conditions, capable of communicating with shore stations on both sides of the Atlantic. The set had experienced a short circuit early in the voyage, an equipment failure that had kept Phillips working for much of one night to repair, and as a consequence, a backlog of passenger messages had accumulated that was taking most of the voyage to clear. On the evening of April 14th, the wireless room was busy with passenger traffic. This is important, because throughout the day, the wireless room had also been receiving messages of a different kind, messages from other ships in the vicinity reporting ice, and the management of those messages, the prioritizing of passenger traffic over navigational information, would become one of the defining controversies of the inquiry that followed. We will return to this. For now, simply note that at 10:30 in the evening of April 14th, 1912, the wireless room of the Titanic was busy, and Phillips was at the key, and the night was quiet and cold and perfectly clear, and the ship was moving at 22.5 knots through water that, had any of the instruments then available measured it, was registering a surface temperature of around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing for fresh water, but sea water, with its salt content, freezes at a slightly lower temperature. The water was, in other words, almost precisely as cold as ice. Section 3. Particular lives. Margaret and Isidore. Let us stay, for a moment, with Isidore and Ida Strauss. They had come to dinner early, as they always did, and had taken their usual table, not the best table in the room, not the table of maximum visibility, but the table they preferred, slightly to one side, where the sightlines were good and the service was attentive without being intrusive. Ida wore a dress she had brought from Paris, dark blue silk with a cream bodice, and Isidore wore his dinner suit and the slight, comfortable air of a man who has eaten in very good restaurants for long enough that the quality of the food is something he registers and appreciates without being greatly excited by. They ate slowly. They talked. They always talked. It was one of the things people noted about them, that they still, after 41 years, talked to each other during meals with what appeared to be genuine mutual interest. They had raised 6 children. They had built a department store into one of the great commercial institutions of New York. They had weathered the ordinary catastrophes of a long life. Illness, financial setback, the deaths of friends and contemporaries, and had arrived, together, at a late middle age that combined the comfort of security with the particular tenderness of people who know that time is not infinite and who have chosen, consciously or not, to spend it in each other's company. After dinner, they returned to their stateroom and sat together for a while, reading. Ida read. She had a novel she had been working through since Southampton, a romantic thing she had picked up in London and found surprisingly absorbing. Isidore read the newspapers, 2 days old, but still, the newspapers. Later, they might take a short walk on the promenade deck before bed. They had done this every evening of the crossing. Outside their window, the Atlantic slid past in the dark. They had no particular premonition, no dream, no shiver, no sudden sense that the world was about to turn. They were two old people in a comfortable room on a fine ship, and they were doing what they always did, and they were content. That is enough, and that is everything. Thomas Andrews and his notebook. Thomas Andrews had gone to bed at around 11 and then, as was his habit at sea, had risen again almost immediately and gone back to work. His notebook was almost full. He had been filling it since Belfast, since the sea trials, in fact, with the painstaking accumulation of small imperfections that only the ship's designer would notice or care about. The private promenade deck screws were not the right type. The stateroom hat hooks needed to be repositioned. The writing room could use additional chairs. The pebble dashing in the first-class reception room had been finished to a slightly rough standard. The ships in the staircase frieze needed touching up. He had written to his wife Helen on Tuesday. The ship is looking grand, and I am very proud of her. He had written to his daughter Elizabeth, 4 years old, who called him Dada. A separate letter full of the particular kind of news that a father shares with a very small child. What he had seen from the deck, what the water looked like, what he had eaten for breakfast. He was not a man who allowed himself leisure very easily. The Titanic was his life's work, not metaphorically, but literally. He had spent years on her, had overseen her construction from the laying of the keel to the final fitting of the carpets, had been present at decisions down to the choice of tile pattern in the Turkish bath and the precise shade of green in the reception room upholstery. He knew her the way a doctor knows a patient's body, specifically, intimately, with a kind of professional love that is distinct from personal affection but is, in its commitment and its care, not entirely different from it. He was 39. He had been married for 4 years. He intended to retire from active engineering by 45 and spend more time at his house in Belfast and in Ardra, County Donegal, where his family had roots and where the landscapes were the kind that make people understand why certain places become necessary to certain people. He was a good man in the specific and unshowy way that good men often are. He was kind to junior employees. He visited his mother regularly. He gave credit to others for work they had done in his teams. He was cheerful without being ebullient, intelligent without being difficult, ambitious without being ruthless. In another era, in different circumstances, he would simply have been a successful man who lived a quietly honorable life and died in due course having been loved by the people who knew him. On the night of April 14, 1912, he was sitting in the first-class reading room with his notebook, writing down observations about the ship, and his face was calm and concentrated and entirely unaware of what the next 3 hours would require of him. Jack Thayer and the feeling of the night. Jack Thayer was 17 years old. He was traveling first class with his parents, his father John B. Thayer II, second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and his mother Marion. And he was at the age when parents and their dinner parties and their social obligations feel slightly insufficient, and slightly insufficient is, at 17, a very specific and rather pleasant kind of suffering. After dinner, he had excused himself from his parents' table and gone to find other company. He had met, through the social machinery of the first-class promenade, a young man named Milton Long, 29, also traveling first class, also American, who had the particular quality of a person who is good to talk to without being so overwhelming that you lose track of your own thoughts in the conversation. They had walked the promenade deck together and then, finding it too cold, had come inside and sat in the first-class lounge for a while, talking about the things that young men in first class on an Atlantic liner in 1912 talked about: university, prospects, sport, the future. At around 10:30, they parted, and Thayer went back to his stateroom to change into warmer clothes before going out on deck again. Not because he needed to go out, exactly, but because the night had that quality sometimes, the quality of being too clear and too cold and too full of stars to stay inside. He stood at the rail for a while. He noted, later, the absolute stillness of the water, flat as a table, he said, flat as a plate of glass, and the brilliance of the stars, and the temperature, which was below freezing, and the sense of immensity that the ocean gives you at night when you stand at the rail of a ship and look out at it. He noted, also, that it was very quiet except for the engines, and that the engines had been constant and steady the entire crossing, and that the constancy of them had become something like silence, a background hum against which everything else was defined. He was standing at the rail, 17 years old, with the Atlantic night around him and the ship moving steadily through it, and whatever he was feeling in that moment, whether it was the ordinary restlessness of a 17-year-old or whether there was something else in it, something that only the retrospect of extreme experience would later name, he did not go in for another few minutes. He stood at the rail and looked at the dark sea. And out there, in the dark, at a distance that was closing by 370 feet every 10 seconds, something was waiting. Section 4, The Last Evening. Sunday, April 14th, 1912, the final hours. The ship's clocks had been set back 47 minutes at midnight on Saturday, which meant that by the conventional reckoning of the crossing, Sunday, April 14th, had begun in the small hours of what the Atlantic sky understood as very early morning. The passengers had largely slept through this adjustment. The crew had not. They never did. Sunday had been, by all accounts, a remarkably pleasant day. The weather had continued fine. The sea had remained calm. The sun had risen on a North Atlantic that was doing its best impression of the Mediterranean, and the cold had been of the sharp, bracing, invigorating kind rather than the gray, miserable, seasick-making kind. Passengers who had spent the previous 2 days largely inside, adjusting to the rhythms of the ship, emerged onto the decks and rediscovered the specific pleasure of being at sea in good weather, the sense of space, of cleanness, the way the ocean air fills the lungs and makes the interior of the ship feel slightly overheated and faintly claustrophobic by comparison. There had been a religious service in the first-class dining saloon at 10:30 in the morning, conducted by Captain Smith himself. It was a tradition on Sunday crossings, and the captain, in his gold-braided dress uniform, read the liturgy with the quiet authority of a man who has conducted such services many times. The first-class passengers attended in their Sunday best, the women in their furs and hats, the men in dark suits, filling the long room with the slightly formal, slightly uncomfortable air that Sunday services always generate in people who are not quite certain how religious they are. The afternoon had passed slowly and pleasantly in the way that Sunday afternoons on ocean liners always do. A little reading, a little walking, a little conversation, a long lunch, a nap for those who could arrange it, tea at 4, the first thoughts about dressing for dinner. The gymnasium had been busy for much of the afternoon. Colonel Gracie had been there, working himself into a satisfactory state of exertion on the rowing machine. John Jacob Astor had spent half an hour on the stationary bicycle, and the swimming bath had seen more use than it had on any previous day of the crossing. In the afternoon, a group of second-class passengers had conducted their own religious service, a more evangelical affair than the captain's morning liturgy, in the second-class dining saloon, led by Reverend Harper, who preached, according to those who heard him, with his usual combination of scriptural rigor and personal warmth. He had chosen his text carefully. He had spoken about the importance of being ready. He had spoken about the suddenness with which life could change. It is tempting to read this as premonition, but it would be dishonest. Harper preached about readiness and faith as regularly as other ministers preached about charity or justice. It was simply the Sunday he had prepared. Through the day, the temperature had been dropping steadily. At noon, it was 43 degrees Fahrenheit on deck. By 4 o'clock, 39. By 6, 33. By the time the first-class dinner service began at 7, the thermometers outside the bridge were reading 30 degrees. The passengers who ventured onto the promenade deck between dinner courses to take the air came back inside quickly and commented on the cold. It was startling, the cold, a kind of cold that went through a fur coat in a way that a November evening in London or New York simply did not, a cold with a particular bite to it that the North Atlantic specializes in. The stewards who had been on these runs before knew what that cold meant. You didn't need to look at the ice reports to understand it. You could feel it in the air. The ice warnings. Here we must be precise, because precision matters, and because the question of what was known and when it was known and by whom and to what effect is one of the central questions of the entire story. Throughout April 14th, 1912, The wireless room of the Titanic received a series of ice warnings from other vessels in the area. Let us lay them out, one by one, in the order in which they arrived. At 9 in the morning, the Coronia, a Cunard liner, sent a message reporting bergs, growlers, and field ice at 42 degrees north, from 49 degrees to 51 degrees west. This message was received by Phillips, brought to the bridge, and logged. Captain Smith saw it and handed it to Ismay, who put it in his pocket. He showed it at dinner to several passengers, not as an alarm, but as a conversational curiosity. He returned it to Smith that evening. At 1 in the afternoon, the Baltic, another White Star vessel, sent a report that the Greek steamer Athenae had passed icebergs and large quantities of field ice at 41 degrees 51 minutes north, 49 degrees 52 minutes west. This message was delivered to Captain Smith on the bridge. Smith pocketed it and gave it, again, to Ismay, who placed it in his jacket pocket. It stayed there for some hours. At 1:40 in the afternoon, the America, a German liner, sent an ice report to the U.S. Hydrographic Office via relay through the Titanic's wireless. Large icebergs at 41 degrees 27 minutes north, 50 degrees 8 minutes west. This message was not delivered to the bridge. It was relayed as directed and then set aside. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a message from the Californian reported 3 large bergs at 42 degrees 3 minutes north, 49 degrees 9 minutes west. At 7:21 in the evening, a message from the Californian again saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice, weather good, clear. This message was logged but, and here the record becomes less certain, it is unclear whether it was delivered to the bridge. And finally, the last and most urgent, at 10:30 at night, a message from the Californian again, sent directly to the Titanic at the closest range of the evening. We are stopped and surrounded by ice. But by this time, Phillips was submerged in the backlog of passenger traffic, under pressure from the Cape Ray shore station that was waiting for the volume of telegrams he had queued up, and when the Californian's operator broke in on his frequency without the proper protocols, Phillips, frazzled, overworked, not fully registering the content of what was being said, cut him off. Shut up, he sent. I am busy. I am working Cape Race. The Californian's operator, Cyril Evans, had been on duty for most of the day. He was tired. He listened for a moment, heard nothing further, switched off his equipment, and went to bed. And so the last warning went unheard. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Titanic, the question of speed had not yet been resolved in the way that subsequent events would demand it be resolved. The Titanic had not slowed. The reason for this, or the reasons, plural, because no single factor entirely explains it, has been debated ever since. The general practice of the era, which was to maintain speed in clear weather and rely on lookouts, the commercial pressure to arrive on schedule, the competitive dynamics of Atlantic crossing records, the confidence, specific to this ship at this moment, that she was large enough and strong enough to manage the encounter if one occurred, and, perhaps most simply, the way that expertise can become its own form of blindness, in which the person who has navigated a danger many times without incident gradually, almost imperceptibly, ceases to register the danger with the urgency it deserves. Captain Smith had crossed the Atlantic perhaps 500 times. He had encountered ice before. He had, in his long career, never struck an iceberg. The night was clear. The lookouts were in the crow's nest. The officers were on the bridge. The engines were running smoothly at 22.5 knots. He went asleep. Section 5, The Collision. 11:39 p.m. Frederick Fleet saw it first. He saw it because he was looking, because looking was his entire job, and because his eyes, young and adjusted to the dark, focused on the exact point where the darkness ahead of the ship resolved, if you stared long enough and hard enough, into distinguishable shapes, caught it at what he would later estimate was approximately 500 yards ahead of the bow. It was darker than the sky around it. Not black exactly. The sky was very nearly black tonight, clear and moonless, the stars providing more light than no light, but less light than the horizon needed, but darker than the dark, a gray-black shape that was simply there where nothing had been, and it was large, and it was not moving, which meant that it was not moving because the ship was moving toward it at a rate that covered 500 yards in about 30 seconds. He reached for the telephone and rang the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. That was all. 3 words, and a ring of the lookout bell. On the bridge, 6th Officer Moody answered the phone, heard the words, and relayed them to 1st Officer Murdoch, who was already moving because he had seen it, or something, through the bridge windows at almost the same moment that Fleet's call came through. Murdoch acted immediately. He gave the order to put the helm hard a starboard, which, in the convention of 1912, swung the bow to the left, to port, and simultaneously gave the telegraph order to stop engines, and then, moments later, full reverse. Then he reached for the watertight door switch and closed the doors to the boiler rooms, to the engine rooms, to all the compartments below the waterline. These were the right actions. They were the actions a trained, experienced officer takes when a collision is imminent. Whether they were exactly the right actions in the precise sequence, or whether a different decision in those 30 seconds might have produced a different outcome, this has been debated for more than a century, and we will return to it. What we know is this: they were not enough. The bow swung left. It swung left in the slow way that an 882-foot ship's bow swings left at 22 knots. Not quickly, not responsively, but in the large, majestic, slightly awful way of an enormous mass attempting to change direction in a medium that resists change of direction. The iceberg, blue-gray and ancient, a piece of a Greenland glacier that had calved, scientists believe, some weeks earlier and drifted south on the Labrador Current, passed along the starboard side of the bow. It did not make the kind of noise that appears in popular imagination. There was no great metallic shriek, no grinding roar. Passengers in the forward section heard a grinding, scraping sound that many described as sliding. Something sliding along the side of the ship, or something sliding past, the way a piece of furniture slides when you push it across a floor. Some passengers felt a vibration, a trembling, a sense of the ship shuddering momentarily in the way a ship does when the engines are suddenly reversed. Many felt and heard nothing at all. The iceberg scraped along approximately 300 feet of the starboard side of the ship's hull below the waterline, and in doing so, it opened a series of tears and punctures and gaps in the steel plating that collectively admitted the North Atlantic Ocean at a rate of approximately 38,000 cubic feet per minute. In the crow's nest, Fleet felt the near miss and let out a long breath. In the boiler rooms, the watertight doors closed with a boom that the stokers felt in their feet, and a moment later, cold salt water began to flood in around the hatch seals and through the hull below them, and the firemen who were in the lower sections began to climb. On the bridge, Murdoch looked at the ship's head and knew, before anything else happened, before any report came in, before the captain appeared, knew with the certainty of a man who has spent 20 years learning what ships do and do not do, that something was very wrong. In his stateroom, Captain Smith was awake before the watch officer reached his door to knock. He was dressed and on the bridge within 2 minutes. In the first-class smoking room, the card game paused as the players felt the vibration, looked at each other, shrugged, and returned to their cards. Someone made a joke about the ship hitting a wave. Someone else suggested they were in New York already. Small laughter. In the third-class forward compartments, the sound had been much louder. The sound of something enormous passing along the hull just feet away is very different when you are on F deck rather than a deck. And people were awake, sitting up in their bunks, listening to the dripping water that was beginning to find its way through the seams and the porthole frames and the access doors, listening to it in the bewildered, pre-understanding silence of people who have been woken from sleep by a sound they cannot yet place. The time was 11:40 p.m. The Titanic had 2 hours and 40 minutes left to live. Section 6. The First Moments. The Wound. Thomas Andrews went to examine the ship. He went with Captain Smith and the ship's carpenter, John Hutchinson, and they moved quickly through the forward decks, down into the holds, through the service corridors that most passengers would never see, down to the places where the water was already arriving. The mail room was flooding. The postal clerks, 5 men who had been working through the evening, sorting the American mail, cheerful and efficient and oblivious to everything above and below them until the water came, were now wading in seawater that was rising visibly, quickly, with the purposeful urgency of water filling a space that has been designed, without quite being understood as such, to be filled. They were attempting to move the mail sacks to higher shelves. They would not succeed in saving the mail. Boiler room number 6 had flooded within moments of the collision and had been evacuated. The men in it had barely made it through the watertight doors before the doors closed. Boiler room number 5 was taking water through a rupture aft of the watertight bulkhead, slower but steady. The forward holds number 1, 2, and 3, were filling rapidly. Andrews made his calculations. He was a structural engineer of exceptional ability, and the calculations he was making in those minutes were the most important calculations he would ever make. And he knew, with the absolute clarity of a man who understands both the mathematics and what the mathematics mean, that they were catastrophic. The ship had 15 watertight compartments. She could float with any 2 of them flooded. She could float with the first 4, the forward holds, and the first 2 boiler rooms, flooded. But the 6th boiler room was flooded, and the 5th was flooding, and water was finding its way over the tops of the bulkheads, because the bulkheads did not extend to the main deck, a design compromise that had seemed acceptable when it was made. And once the water began to spill from one compartment to the next, there was nothing to stop it. He told Captain Smith. He said, "She can float for an hour and a half, possibly 2 hours." He may have said it more precisely than that. He was a precise man. He may have drawn a small diagram in his notebook, in the way that engineers do when they are trying to explain something to someone who does not have the technical background to follow the explanation without visual assistance. Whatever he said, and however he said it, the captain understood. The Titanic was going to sink. There was no if. There was no unless. There was a time frame, an hour and a half, possibly 2 hours, and beyond it, nothing. The captain went back to the bridge and gave the order to uncover the lifeboats, the passengers. In those first 40 minutes, the 40 minutes between the collision and the first lifeboat being swung out, the most characteristic thing that happened is also, in retrospect, the most heartbreaking. Very little happened. The passengers, for the most part, did not know that the ship was sinking. Many did not even know that anything was wrong. The collision had been felt as a shudder, a juddering, a brief interruption of the smooth, even forward motion of the ship, and it had been so mild, so much gentler than anything that popular imagination associates with catastrophe, that people had interpreted it variously as a large wave, a propeller problem, the ship stopping for some reason, something being dropped in the hold. They had then, most of them, gone back to sleep, or to their card games, or to their conversations. Some had not. Some had got up and put on dressing gowns and gone into the corridors to see what the matter was. They found, and this is precisely the kind of detail that makes the story so painful to absorb, that the corridors were calm. The stewards were there, because the stewards were always there, but they were not alarmed, or if they were alarmed, they were performing the absence of alarm with the professional discipline that their training required. They told passengers that everything was fine, there had been a minor incident, they could return to their cabins. And most passengers, reassured by the calm of the people who were supposed to know, returned to their cabins. On a deck, in the first-class staterooms, people opened their portholes and saw something they had not expected: ice. Small chunks of ice on the promenade deck, spilled from the face of the berg as it passed. Some passengers picked up pieces and examined them with a sort of detached curiosity. They were souvenirs of something, though of what exactly was not yet clear. Charles Lightoller, the second officer, would later recall seeing a group of first-class passengers playing football with a large piece of ice on the forward well deck at about midnight, laughing at their improvised sport in the cold night air. Football, with a piece of the iceberg, while the ship was filling with water below them. This is not stupidity. This is the fundamental human mechanism of not yet knowing. They did not know. They had not been told. The architecture of the Titanic was, in many ways, the architecture of not knowing. Her decks were so long, her spaces so vast, the distance between the forward hold flooding and the first-class staterooms so great, that the disaster was simply not visible from where they stood. You had to go below, far below, past the mail room and the baggage room and the squash court that was already underwater, to understand what was happening. And they had not been told to go below. They had been told, in the quiet, controlled language of authority under pressure, that everything was fine. It was not fine. It would never be fine again. Section 7. The evacuation. The lifeboats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. She was designed to carry 64. This is the fact that, once stated, demands some contextual scaffolding before it can be properly understood, because the instinct is to assume criminal negligence and the reality is considerably more damning. The 20 lifeboats she carried were, At the time of her construction, not merely legal, but more than legal. She exceeded the British Board of Trade's lifeboat requirements, which were based on a calculation formula relating to gross tonnage that had last been updated in 1894 and which, in the 18 years since, had never been revisited despite the dramatic increase in the size of the ships to which they applied. In 1894, the largest ocean liner then afloat displaced around 13,000 tons. By 1912, the Titanic displaced 46,000. The regulation had not kept pace. The regulation required 16 lifeboats for any ship over 10,000 tons, regardless of whether the ship in question was 14,000 tons or 60,000 tons. The Titanic carried 16 standard lifeboats plus 4 Engelhart collapsible boats, 20 total, which was, by the letter of the law, compliant. The 20 lifeboats had a combined capacity of approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people aboard. The gap between those two numbers, 1,046 people, is the gap that the history of the Titanic is ultimately about. It is the gap that swallowed the majority of the men in third class. It is the gap that the musicians played into. It is the gap in which people prayed and wrote last letters and held on to each other and tried, in the various ways that human beings try things when trying is all that is left, to survive. But before we arrive at that gap, we must understand how slowly the evacuation began and why. Charles Lightoller and the order of things. Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller was 38 years old, and he was the most senior officer to survive the sinking, and his testimony at the subsequent inquiries would be, in its combination of precise nautical detail and strategic defensiveness, one of the most studied documents in the history of maritime disaster. He was a compact, determined man, with the kind of face that suggests he has been making decisions under pressure for long enough that the pressure no longer particularly registers. He had been at sea since he was 13, had served on cattle ships and sailing vessels in the Great North Atlantic. Steamers, had survived a ship fire and a castaway experience on a Queensland beach and a Klondike Gold Rush adventure, and was, by April 1912, one of the most experienced officers in the White Star Fleet. He was also, on the night of April 14th, in charge of the portside lifeboat loading, a task that he approached with the rigidity that his training and his era imposed upon him. He loaded women and children first. He loaded women and children only, refusing, on several occasions, to allow men into a lifeboat even when the lifeboat was being lowered with available space. This decision, which followed the maritime convention of women and children first as Lightoller interpreted it, which was women and children exclusively, rather than women and children before men, but fill the boat, meant that several lifeboats left the ship with room for 20 or 30 additional passengers that they did not contain. Lifeboat number 1 left with 12 people aboard. It had a capacity of 40. This is one of the central facts of the Titanic story, and it demands to be sat with for a moment. 12 people, in a boat for 40, while more than 1,000 people would die in the water. The reasons for it are multiple: the darkness, the noise and confusion of the deck, the passengers' general reluctance to get into a boat slung 40 feet above the black ocean when the ship beneath them still felt solid and warm and lit, the social ordering of the deck that made it difficult for people to push forward or be assertive in ways that the class structure discouraged, the physical difficulty of loading a lifeboat without adequate lighting and with untrained seamen working the davits for the first time under pressure. And there is also this: the passengers did not yet fully believe the ship was sinking. Some did. Some had spoken to officers who had told them plainly, or had been below and seen the water, but most did not. Most stood on the deck in their life jackets with the slightly absurd air of people wearing swimming costumes to a party where no one is swimming, watching the crew fuss with the boats and wondering why exactly they had been woken up and whether they could go back inside, because it was absolutely freezing out here. The cold was extraordinary. It had dropped to 28 degrees. The breath came in visible clouds. The stars blazed with the particular brilliance of the very cold and very clear, and the ocean around the ship was dark and flat and still. There was no moon. The Titanic's lights, still burning, still full and brilliant, threw a corridor of illumination out onto the black water that served, if anything, to make the dark beyond the lights seem even more impenetrable. No one wanted to get into the boats. No one wanted to leave the lights. The musicians. By midnight, the ship's band was playing on the boat deck. Let us be clear about who they were, because they deserve that clarity. They were 8 men, employed not by White Star Line, but by an agency called Black Talent, paid a fixed wage per crossing, responsible for their own instruments and their own uniforms. They had been assigned to play for first-class passengers throughout the crossing, dinner music, afternoon tea, the occasional concert in the first-class reception room. And they had been doing so with the professionalism and relative anonymity that musical accompaniment at social gatherings requires. Their bandmaster was Wallace Henry Hartley. He was 33 years old. He was from Cone, in Lancashire, the son of a church choirmaster, a man who had grown up in a house where music was not entertainment but something more like air. He played violin, and he played it well. Not with the wild expressiveness of a performer who needs an audience to exist, but with the steadiness and commitment of a musician who understands that his job is to serve the music rather than display himself through it. He had been engaged to be married. His fiancée, Maria Robinson, was at home in Dewsbury. He had been going to sea for several years, saving money for their wedding. The other 7 musicians, John Wesley Woodward, cellist, Fred Clark, double bass, Roger Burkoo, cellist, George Crins, violinist, Theodore Brayley, pianist, John Broadbent Hume, violinist, Percy Cornelius Taylor, pianist and cellist. They came from England and Belgium and France. Some were very young. Burkoo was 20. Hume was 21. They had assembled, at some point around midnight, at the top of the first-class staircase, and had begun to play. What they played, and in what order, is a matter of historical debate that will probably never be fully resolved. Survivors' accounts are sufficiently various and sufficiently imprecise to make a definitive set list impossible. They played ragtime, probably. They played popular songs of the day. They played, according to some accounts, hymns. The question of whether they played Nearer, My God, to Thee in the final minutes has generated so much historical commentary that it has almost obscured the more fundamental fact. They played at all. They did not have to. They could have taken places in the boats. At least some of them could have, at the rate the boats were loading. They chose not to. They chose, or perhaps arrived at through a process less dramatic than choice, the decision to keep playing, to maintain the music against the cold and the dark and the rising noise of a ship beginning, very gradually, to acknowledge what was happening to her. Why? It is a question that begs a simple answer and resists one. Perhaps they played because playing was what they did, and the alternative was not playing, and not playing in those circumstances was something none of them could quite bring themselves to initiate. Perhaps they played because they understood, at some level, that music was the only form of order they had to offer, and that order, even the small, fragile order of 8 men playing in the cold, was better than no order at all. Perhaps some of them hoped, still, for a ship on the horizon. Perhaps some of them had moved beyond hope to something else, some attitude for which English has several clumsy approximations, grace, acceptance, courage, and had decided that if this was the last night, it should at least have music. The passengers on the boat deck heard the music, and some of them, later, said it helped. It kept the panic at a particular level, below the threshold at which crowds become mobs, below the threshold at which the situation loses all human shape. It was something to listen to when listening was better than thinking. The musicians played. The boats, port side and starboard. While the musicians played, the business of loading the lifeboats continued on both sides of the ship with the chaotic, human-flawed, desperately inadequate urgency of people attempting to manage a catastrophe with the tools and training and social structures they have. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch was loading boats with a slightly more liberal interpretation of women and children first than lightholders. He allowed men to board when no women were present. This meant that the starboard boats tended to leave a little fuller than the port side boats, though still not full. Boat number 7, the first boat lowered, went into the water at 12:40 a.m. with 27 people aboard. It had a capacity of 65. This is the pattern that repeats, with variations, across all 20 boats. The boats going into the water below their capacity, the capacity that was already grievously insufficient, while people remained on the deck. The process was slow and difficult and poorly managed in ways that were not entirely anyone's fault and were, simultaneously, the product of choices that had been made, about the number of boats, about the quality of drills, about the training of crew, that reflected broader assumptions about what was possible and what was necessary on a ship like this. The Titanic had held a lifeboat drill on April 14th. This was, in maritime law, required for Sunday crossings. The drill had been brief and incompletely executed. The boats had been uncovered and the crew had mustered, but they had not actually lowered the boats, and they had not practiced the davit mechanisms, and they had not run through the loading procedures with the attention to detail that the situation now demanded. This was normal. Lifeboat drills on ocean liners in 1912 were, by common consent among the officers who conducted them, a formality, a legal obligation rather than a genuine preparation for the scenario that was now unfolding. The scenario that was now unfolding was the scenario that no one in the history of the Titanic's design, construction, or operation had genuinely, seriously, viscerally prepared for: the ship sinking. Not in the abstract. Not as a theoretical possibility that the watertight compartments were designed to prevent, but actually sinking here, tonight, in the North Atlantic, with 2,224 people aboard. Section 8. The human detail. Women and the separation. The loading of the lifeboats accomplished something that the social world of the ship had never done. It divided people absolutely, and the division was the oldest and most fundamental one. Women went first. Men stayed. This meant, in practice, the most painful kind of separation: husbands and wives who had been side by side for 40 years finding themselves on opposite sides of a gunwale, or a railing, or the simple, terrible distance between a lifeboat and a deck. It meant, in some cases, fathers and sons who would never see each other again saying goodbye in the compressed, inefficient way that sudden goodbyes force on people who have a whole relationship to condense into 2 minutes. Ida Strauss would not get into a lifeboat without Isidore. She said this with the absolute quiet certainty of a woman who has decided something that is not subject to negotiation. She is reported to have said, "We have lived together so many years. Where you go, I go," or words to that effect. The exact words are disputed by survivors, which matters less than the gesture they describe. She sat down beside him on a deck chair, and they sat together in the cold, and they were seen by various people who passed them in the hours that followed, sitting together, holding hands, and the last time anyone saw them they were still there. They were still there when the water came. John Jacob Astor helped his wife, Madeline, into Lifeboat 4. Late in the loading, the boat rail level with the deck by then, the ship having settled forward into the water. He asked if he might accompany his wife. Given her condition, she was 18 years old and pregnant, and was told no. He accepted this with the composure that very large fortunes sometimes generate in very large disasters. A sort of practiced stillness that is difficult to read as either courage or numbness, and maybe some combination of both. He tucked his wife in, gave her his gloves. He stood back. He was last seen with a glass of brandy and a cigarette, apparently calm. Benjamin Guggenheim, who had been awakened by his valet Victor Giglio, and had initially dressed in his life jacket before returning to his cabin to change into full evening dress, was seen on the deck sometime after midnight in his dinner suit, apparently at ease, apparently resigned, and he said, "It is one of the famous statements of the night, and by now it has the quality of a line written for a play," which perhaps it was, perhaps it became, in the refining of its transmission through multiple accounts. "We've dressed up in our best, and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." What he meant by gentlemen in that moment is worth considering. Perhaps he meant, without panic. Perhaps he meant, with the maintenance of a certain outward form that, even here, even now, serves some function he cannot fully articulate, but has, in the upbringing that shaped him, been made to feel is important. Perhaps he meant nothing more coherent than a refusal to abandon the costume he had been wearing all his life simply because the stage was sinking. Third class. The third-class passengers did not receive life jackets delivered to their cabins by stewards. They did not hear officers knocking on their doors and calmly explaining the situation. They did not, in many cases, receive any official guidance at all for the first hour and more after the collision. This is documented. It is not contested. It is one of the most damning facts of the disaster, and it must be stated plainly. The evacuation of the Titanic in its first critical hour privileged the first-class passengers in ways that were not merely the product of proximity and familiarity, but of the active, if not always conscious, prioritization of certain lives over others. The gates that separated third class from second class, the barriers that existed, in part, because American immigration law required that steerage passengers be kept separate from the general population during an Atlantic crossing, were not opened promptly. Some gates were opened early by individual crew members acting on their own initiative. Others remained locked, or were managed by a single crew member who stood at the gate and allowed people through in small groups, apparently concerned that the third-class passengers would overwhelm the boat deck if released in a mass. This concern was not irrational given the arithmetic: 710 third-class passengers, 20 lifeboats, 1,078 spaces total. But the concern was applied asymmetrically. Nobody was restricting the movement of first-class passengers out of concern that they might overwhelm the boat deck. Only the poorest passengers were managed in this way. Some third-class passengers found their own way up. They moved through the crew corridors, through the galley, through the staff passages that connected the lower decks to the boat deck, finding the paths that the knowledge of the ship provided if you were determined and mobile and not impeded by small children or by language barriers, or by the simple, terrible bewilderment of waking up in the lower decks of a sinking ship in the middle of the North Atlantic with no idea what was happening or where to go. Some did not make it up in time. The gates, the distances, the staircases that were by 1 o'clock at night waist-deep in water. These were not metaphors. They were physical obstacles that cost specific people their specific lives. Nikola, the Croatian father with the infant son, we do not know with certainty what happened to him. We know he did not survive. We know his infant son survived, placed in a lifeboat by some account by a crew member, the origin of the child not established until weeks after the disaster. We know his wife did not survive. Mariana, the Syrian mother with 4 children, she survived with 2 of them. The youngest 2 did not survive. The story of the Titanic is told, very often, as a story about individuals. Isidore and Ida, Hartley and his violin, Astor and his evening dress, the ice and the lifeboats and the band. But beneath those individual stories, running through them like a current of ice water, is the story of what a society reveals about itself when it must decide, in the most literal possible way, who lives and who dies. And what was revealed in the lifeboats and the locked gates and the differences in survival rates between first and third class was not flattering, and it was not accidental, and it deserves to be named. First class survival rate, approximately 60%. Second class survival rate, approximately 44%. Third class survival rate, approximately 25%. Of the third class men, approximately 16% survived. These are not numbers generated by the random cruelty of the sea. They are numbers generated by the structured cruelties of a world that, even in catastrophe, continued to apportion its chances of survival according to the price of the ticket. Section 9. The ship in her last hour. The bow goes down. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the Titanic's bow was visibly lower in the water. It was not a dramatic angle, not yet. But to those who knew what to look for, who had been trained to read the waterline and the list and the angle of a ship relative to the horizon, it was unmistakable. The ship was going. She was going slowly, slowly enough that the evacuation still felt, to some, like it might be an overreaction, but she was going with absolute certainty, with the remorseless slow-motion certainty of physics applied to 46,000 tons of steel and ocean. The lights were still on. This was important, practically and psychologically. The Titanic maintained electrical power for a surprisingly long time, and the lights remained burning at full strength until nearly the very end, so that the ship appeared, from a distance, to be perfectly intact and perfectly normal, sitting slightly low in the water but otherwise unchanged, the long lines of her portholes still glowing warmly in the dark. From the lifeboats, already pulling away on the black water, the view of the ship was extraordinary. It was overwhelming, in the specific way that the combination of beauty and horror overwhelms. The huge, brilliantly lit ship against the black sky and the black ocean, the stars above her and around her, the sound of the band still faintly audible, the noise of steam venting from the funnels beginning at around 12:30, a roar that a survivor described as the sound of 1,000 steam whistles blowing at once, so loud that speech was impossible within 50 feet of the ship. The lifeboats spread out across the water in a rough semicircle, most of them stopping a few hundred yards from the ship, close enough to return if return became possible, far enough, people hoped, to avoid the suction when the ship went down. The water temperature was 28 degrees. In that water, a person without a life jacket would lose consciousness in 15 minutes and die in 30. A person with a life jacket would stay afloat longer, but the cold would kill them all the same. The heart is the first organ to fail in extreme cold, and in 28-degree water, even the strongest heart begins to fail within 45 minutes. This knowledge did not help the people in the water who were thinking about it. It did not help them at all. Carpathia. At 12:45 in the morning, 5 minutes after the first lifeboat was lowered, Jack Phillips in the wireless room sent the first distress call. CQD, 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 SOS, 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 CQD, MGY. MGY was the Titanic's call sign. CQD was the older distress signal. Come quick, danger, in the interpretation that most operators used. SOS was the newer international signal, adopted in 1906, but not yet universal. Phillips sent both. He sent them again and again, in the patient, rapid-fire rhythm of a man who has learned that repetition is the only guarantee of receipt in the uncertainties of wireless transmission. Various ships heard the call. The Frankfurt answered, too far away. The Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, answered, 600 miles away. The Baltic answered, 500 miles. The Virginian answered. And then, at 12:47 in the morning, a small Cunard liner called the Carpathia answered. She was 58 miles to the southeast. Her captain was Arthur Henry Rostron, 31. At the time of the Titanic's distress call, had just fallen asleep in his cabin when his wireless operator, Harold Cottam, woke him with the news. Rostron was a man of the specific kind of urgent competence that emergencies tend to either discover or destroy in people, and what the emergency discovered in him was exceptional. He had his ship turned around and moving at 14 knots, her maximum speed, within minutes. And he spent the next 3 hours driving her through fields of ice in the dark at full speed toward a position that was growing increasingly imprecise as the Titanic's situation developed. He ordered his stewards to prepare his ship for rescue. He ordered blankets and hot drinks and warm food. He arranged the medical staff and prepared the cabins and the dining saloons and the public rooms to receive a large number of people in various states of shock, exposure, and injury. He did all of this while navigating at 14 knots through an ice field in the dark, a piece of seamanship that subsequent examination judged to be either brilliant or reckless or both, depending on the examiner. He would arrive at 4 in the morning. The Titanic would be on the bottom by 2:20. That gap, from 2:20 to 4, is the gap in which most of those who entered the water died. The final hour. The rockets had been going up since 12:45. 8 of them, fired from the bridge at intervals of approximately 5 minutes. Brilliant white pyrotechnic flares that rose 200 or 300 feet above the ship and burst with a sound like a distant cannon shot, scattering bright white stars across the dark sky in the internationally recognized signal for a ship in distress. Aboard the Californian, the ship stopped in the ice approximately 10 to 19 miles to the north. The rockets were seen by the watch officer. He woke the captain, Stanley Lord. Lord, groggy and uncertain and unwilling to act without more information, asked if the rockets were company signals, colored flares used by shipping lines for identification, rather than distress signals. The watch officer said he didn't know. Lord told him to keep trying to contact the ship by Morse lamp and went back to sleep. This decision, or this non-decision, this failure to act, would become the second great controversy of the Titanic disaster, pursued through inquiries, through courts, through a lifetime of accusation and defense on Lord's part, through decades of maritime history. The debate about whether the Californian could have reached the Titanic in time to save lives continues to this day, though the weight of the evidence suggests that she could have, if she had moved promptly, reached the scene before the ship sank and taken aboard a significant number of people. She did not move. Her wireless operator was asleep. Her captain slept. Her officers watched the rockets through binoculars and did not understand, or did not want to understand, what they meant. Meanwhile, the bow of the Titanic continued to settle. By 1:45 in the morning, the angle of the ship was perceptible even to passengers who had no technical reference point for what they were seeing. The bow was perhaps 12 or 15 degrees below the horizontal. The stern was correspondingly lifted. The ship was long and still lit, and still moving slightly in the water, the funnels still steaming, the last two boats still being loaded or already in the water, and the musicians were still playing. There is a survivor account of Wallace Hartley, calm, purposeful, his bow moving across the strings, that has the quality of a constructed moment, a scene too perfectly realized to be entirely trusted, and yet it comes from multiple sources, independently, and what independent sources agree on in the chaos of that night tends to be real. He played. They all played. And at some point around 2 in the morning, they stopped. Not dramatically, not with a last completed phrase, but simply stopped, as people stop when the thing they are doing is no longer doing what it was doing. At 2:05 in the morning, the last lifeboat, Collapsible D, was lowered into the water. There were approximately 1,500 people still on the ship. The breakup. At 2:17 in the morning, the lights went out. Not gradually. All at once, the entire vast illumination of the ship, the thousands of portholes, the deck lights, the bridge lights, the light that had been burning at the end of the gangway since Southampton, all of it went dark simultaneously, and the Titanic became, in an instant, a black shape against the black sky. And then the sounds began. What survivors describe from the lifeboats in the minutes that followed is difficult to convey in prose because it is at the edge of what language is equipped to handle. The sound of a ship breaking apart is not a sound for which everyday experience provides comparison. It is the sound of rivets popping and steel plates shearing and interior walls collapsing and furniture sliding and glass breaking and steam pipes rupturing. All of it at a scale that a large building makes when it falls, filtered by distance and the acoustic properties of cold night air. Survivors called it a roar. They called it a rumble. They called it the sound of an enormous building being demolished. They called it a sound they could never forget and could never adequately describe. The forward funnel collapsed, sending a cascade of soot and steam across the water. The ship broke. This fact, that the Titanic broke, was not accepted for decades after the disaster. Survivors reported it consistently, and they were consistently doubted, because the engineering community found it difficult to accept that a ship of the Titanic's strength and quality of construction could fracture at the surface. The official position, maintained through the British and American inquiries of 1912, was that the ship sank intact. It was not until the discovery of the wreck in 1985 that the truth became incontestable. She broke in two, probably between the third and fourth funnels, at the level of the waterline, the bow and stern separating and going down separately, the stern rising briefly to a near-vertical position before it too went under. The stern rising. Imagine it. The back half of a ship the length of nearly 3 city blocks, tilting upward, water pouring off the exposed propellers and rudder, the remaining people, hundreds of them, some on the railings, some in the water, some somewhere between the two, sliding and falling and holding on as the angle increased past 45 degrees, past 60, past 80, until the stern was nearly vertical against the sky and the ship was standing almost upright on the bow that was already somewhere between 40 and 50 feet below the surface. And then it went. Straight down. Gone. The time was 2:20 in the morning. The Titanic was gone. Section 10. The water. In the lifeboats. What followed the sinking? The 80 minutes between 2:20 and 4 o'clock in the morning, between the ship going down and the Carpathia arriving, was the longest and worst part of the night for everyone involved, in different ways. For those in the lifeboats, it was the cold and the sounds. The cold was absolute, penetrating, the kind of cold that at 28 degrees becomes quickly indistinguishable from pain. The sounds were the 1,000 or 1,500 people in the water, people swimming, people calling for help, people screaming, a sound that the lifeboat survivors describe with a consistency that suggests it was, of all the sounds of that night, the one that lodged most deeply and most lastingly in the body. A great cry, rising from the water. Then, as the minutes passed, diminishing, the voices one by one going silent as the cold took them. Some of the boats went back. Officer Harold Lowe, in charge of Lifeboat 14, pulled together 5 boats into a flotilla, transferred passengers between them to create space, and then, at around 2:30, 10 minutes after the ship sank, went back into the debris field to look for survivors. He found 6 people alive. He could find no more. The other boats did not go back. Their reasons, or the reasons their occupants gave, in the inquiries and the memoirs and the newspaper interviews that followed, included fear of being swamped by people in the water grabbing the gunwales, fear of being pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship, the practical difficulties of rowing in the dark toward a position that was no longer marked by anything visible, the instruction from crew members in the boats not to go back, the simple paralyzing coldness and shock, and the incapacity that extreme fear sometimes produces in otherwise competent people. Some of the people who did not go back would carry that non-decision for the rest of their lives. Some would not. The human capacity for retrospective justification is large, and the pressures of the moment were genuinely extreme, and it is easy, from a distance of more than a century, to say what should have been done and harder to imagine what it actually felt like to be there, in the dark and the cold, hearing the voices, and making the choice not to go. Margaret Brown was in Lifeboat 6. She had been standing on the deck and helping to load the boat when a crew member had, apparently, simply picked her up and deposited her in it. She spent the next several hours organizing the rowing rotation, arguing with the quartermaster who was in nominal charge of the boat and whose authority she declined to acknowledge, and keeping the other women in the boat focused on the task of surviving. She was, by multiple accounts, the most practically effective person in that boat, and she would spend the next several days on the Carpathia organizing the collection of a survivors' relief fund. She was called Unsinkable eventually. She did not care for the name, but she did not argue with the characterization. Lawrence Beasley, the science teacher, was in Lifeboat 13. He watched the ship go down from the boat and found himself, in the analytical reflex that his scientific training had made habitual, noting the specific details of the sinking, the angle of the bow, the position of the lights as they went under, the moment of breakup, the time. His account of those minutes is among the clearest and most precise in the literature of the disaster, and it has that specific quality of the trained observer's account, the precision that is both the account's greatest value and also its most poignant quality, because what the precision describes is something that precision can only partly contain. In the water, people floated on debris and on each other, and on hope and on the rapidly declining currency of body temperature. The water was 28 degrees. You could not fight it. You could not warm it with what was left of your warmth. You could hold on to something for a while, and call for help, and hope, and then the cold would make even hoping too much effort. Jack Thayer, 17 years old, who had been standing at the rail 2 hours earlier looking at the stars, jumped from the ship as it went under and found himself in the water. He managed to reach a piece of debris, a collapsible lifeboat that had been washed off the ship and was floating upside down, and hauled himself onto it. He would later describe the water as beyond anything cold meant, as a thing that removed thought from the mind so efficiently and so quickly that survival became entirely a matter of what the body decided to do in the absence of conscious direction. He survived. He was one of about 30 people who clung to or climbed onto the overturned collapsible boat Collapsible B that night, balancing on its keel in the dark, periodically adjusting their weight as the waterlogged boat moved in the slight swell, telling each other to hold on, hold on. The rescue ship was coming. Charles Lightoller was also on Collapsible B. He was the last surviving officer of the bridge watch, and he organized the group on the upturned keel with the automatic authority of a man who cannot stop being an officer even when the ship is gone. Standing at the aft end, calling out balance adjustments as the boat shifted, keeping people moving when the cold made them want to stop. He would survive the night and give evidence at the inquiries with a stubbornness of tone that some found heroic and others found obstructive. Section 11. Carpathia. The rescue. Captain Rostron was standing on the bridge of the Carpathia at 4 o'clock in the morning when his lookouts began to spot them. The first thing he saw was a flare, a green flare fired from a lifeboat by someone who had been holding it for hours, saving it, waiting for the shape in the dark that might be a ship. Then another. Then, as the Carpathia slowed and the ice that had been appearing in her searchlight beams became more frequent and more alarming, bergs and growlers and field ice, exactly what the ice warnings had described, everywhere. The lifeboats began to resolve out of the dark, small shapes on the black water, some of them moving toward the ship, some of them motionless. It took 4.5 hours to recover the survivors from the water. The first lifeboat came alongside at 4:10. The survivors climbed the Jacob's ladder, or were carried up it, or were lifted in cargo nets, or were helped up by the crew of the Carpathia, who had been standing at the railing since 4 o'clock, watching and waiting and very, very cold themselves. And as they came aboard the Carpathia, they were wrapped in blankets and given hot soup and brandy and brought to the public rooms where the Carpathia's own passengers, woken by the activity and the cold and the silence of stopped engines, moved aside to make room. 710 people came aboard. 710 from a ship that had carried 2,224. 1,514 people had died. Among the dead, Thomas Andrews, Captain Smith, William Murdoch, John Phillips, Wallace Hartley, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss, John Jacob Astor IV, 1,514 others, named and unnamed, wealthy and poor, old and young, the card players and the dancers, and the stokers and the children. Among the living, Lightoller, Beasley, Thayer, Brown, 699 others who would spend the rest of their lives in the company of what they had seen. The Carpathia reached New York on Thursday, April 18th. It rained. The wreckage, the debris field covered an area of several square miles. The Carpathia moved through it carefully, the crew watching the water, looking for more survivors. There were none. What there was everything else. Deck chairs and mattresses and life preservers and cargo, and the particular species of small, ordinary objects that a ship at speed ejects when it breaks apart. Mirrors and books and shoes and bottles and the doors of cabins, and the wooden paneling of the first-class saloon, and silverware and luggage, and an empty davit, and someone's photograph in a silver frame floating face down in the water. The wreckage was everywhere, and it said, in the specific eloquence of inanimate things, what had happened here. What had been a world, a complete and functioning world with its own hierarchy and its own music and its own cuisine and its own daily rhythms. What had been a world was now, in the gray morning light, scattered across 6 square miles of the North Atlantic. The Titanic herself had come to rest on the sea floor at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, 2 miles down, the bow buried in a field of gray-brown silt, the stern torn open and collapsed, the great engines that had driven her at 22 knots lying in the mud several hundred meters from the hull. She would not be found for 73 years. Section 12. Investigations. What followed? The United States Senate had convened its investigation before the Carpathia even docked. Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, not a maritime expert, and attacked by the British press for his lack of expertise with a contempt that said as much about transatlantic condescension as it did about his actual competence, had taken the extraordinary step of demanding that the survivors be questioned before they left American soil. He subpoenaed J. Bruce Ismay in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel on the day the Carpathia arrived, and began a hearing that would last 17 days and take testimony from 82 witnesses. Ismay's presence in Lifeboat C had already, by the time the Carpathia reached New York, become the defining scandal of the disaster. He had, at some point in the final minutes before the last boats were lowered, stepped into Collapsible C as it was being swung out. Stepping in, he testified, when there were no more women or children visible on the deck near the boat. This may have been true. Other witnesses disputed it. The American newspapers, led by William Randolph Hearst Chain, had decided that it was not true and had made of Ismay a figure of comprehensive villainy. The man who built an unsinkable ship that sank, who sent it steaming through an ice field at full speed, and then saved himself while 1,500 people died. The truth was more complicated, as it always is. Ismay had indeed been pressing for speed during the crossing, a fact that both he and Captain Smith acknowledged in their conduct, if not in their testimony. He had been present on the bridge earlier in the voyage and had conveyed, directly or implicitly, the commercial and reputational pressures that the crossing represented. He had kept the ice warnings in his jacket pocket without ensuring that they received the navigational attention they deserved. And then he had survived. He never recovered from this. He gave his testimony to both the American and British inquiries, and he returned to England, and he lived until 1937, but he was, in the years after the Titanic, effectively a recluse, living quietly in Mayfair and in County Galway, declining most social invitations, carrying the ship's ghost in a way that suggested that he knew, at some level, what his survival had cost him. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, ran for 36 days and took evidence from 94 witnesses. Its conclusions were somewhat different in emphasis from the American inquiry. It found that Captain Smith had been negligent in maintaining speed through the ice field, but placed the negligence in the context of industry-wide practice. It found that the lifeboat provision was inadequate and recommended improvements. It found, on the question of the Californian, that the vessel was close enough to have come to the assistance of the Titanic and had failed to do so. Both inquiries missed or declined to fully pursue the deeper systemic questions, the question of class and the differential survival rates, the question of immigration law and the locked gates, the question of what the disaster revealed about the assumptions, about safety, about technology, about the relationship between wealth and risk that had gone into the building and operating of the ship. These questions would not be asked with full force until much later, when the sociology of the disaster began to receive the same scholarly attention as its seamanship. The immediate aftermath. The iceberg, presumably, continued south. In the North Atlantic, icebergs melt at a rate determined by sea temperature and current. The ice that struck the Titanic had been part of a Greenland glacier, probably hundreds of thousands of years old. It had calved sometime in the weeks before April and had drifted south on the Labrador Current, spending those weeks in the cold water of the Western Atlantic, slowly, imperceptibly diminishing. After the night of April 14th, no different, from the iceberg's perspective, from any other night, it continued to drift south into warmer water, continued to melt, grew smaller, and then smaller still, and then, some weeks after the disaster, ceased to exist altogether, absorbed into the ocean from which its constituent atoms had been drawn in a different geological age. The White Star Line issued an immediate statement of condolence and arranged for ships to return to the area to recover bodies. The cable ship Mackay Bennett was the first, arriving at the site on April 17th and spending several days recovering bodies, 293 in total, many of them in groups, held together by the belts of their life preservers, floating in the cold water. The bodies were numbered and described and, where identification was possible, named. Some were buried at sea. Others were brought to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they were interred in 3 cemeteries, some of which still stand as places of pilgrimage. Of the 1,514 who died, fewer than 350 bodies were ever recovered. The rest are down there still, 2 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic, in the silt and the dark, in the company of the ship. Section 13, Legacy. What changed? Things changed. This is worth saying clearly, because there is a tendency in the memorialization of disasters to make them purely about loss, to focus so entirely on what was taken that what was given, however terrible the price, goes unacknowledged. The Titanic disaster changed the way the world thought about ships. In the months and years following the sinking, the Board of Trade lifeboat regulations were rewritten. The new rules required that all ships carry sufficient lifeboat capacity for every person aboard. This regulation, had it existed in 1912, would not have saved the Titanic from the iceberg, but it would have saved the people in the water from the cold. It would have meant not the death rate of 60%, but something less, perhaps much less. The rule change was direct and immediate and consequential. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914 as a direct result of the disaster, an organization initially run by the United States Coast Guard, devoted to monitoring ice in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, reporting on the positions of bergs and field ice, ensuring that what had been known about the ice on the night of April 14th, the ice warnings that had arrived and been partly attended to and partly set aside, could never again be dismissed or mishandled in the way that they had been. The Ice Patrol has operated continuously ever since, except during the 2 World Wars, and in its 100-year history, no ship following its warnings has sunk due to ice. Wireless communications were reformed. The Californian affair, the nearby ship that had gone to sleep with its wireless off, led directly to new international agreements requiring that ships maintain wireless watches around the clock. No longer could a wireless operator knock off at 10:30 and go to bed. The continuous wireless watch became mandatory, and it has saved many lives in the centuries since. Lifeboat drills became genuine drills. Actual loading and lowering of boats, regular practice, crew training that was not merely nominal. The comfortable assumption that a large modern ship would simply not sink. The assumption that had made the lifeboat provision of the Titanic seem adequate because the lifeboats were understood, implicitly, to be supplementary rather than essential, was destroyed utterly by April 15, 1912, and in its destruction created the regulatory framework that governs maritime safety to this day. These are material changes. They are real. They saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. But the Titanic also changed something less tangible and more difficult to articulate. Something about the relationship between technology and trust, between human ambition and the world's indifference to it. The end of an era. There is a before and after to the Titanic that historians have sometimes pressed too hard, making of the disaster a neater cultural pivot point than the evidence fully supports. The Edwardian era did not end because the Titanic sank. The confidence of the age was not shattered by the iceberg in the way that the First World War, 2 years later, would shatter it. The world did not change overnight. And yet, there was something about the Titanic that lodged in the imagination of the age in a way that went beyond the death toll, beyond even the drama of the ice and the night and the lifeboats, and touched something closer to the bone. She was the largest ship ever built. She was, by the best standards of the best engineering of 1912, as safe as it was possible for a ship to be. She was going where such ships always go. She was doing what she was built to do. And she sank. Not because of war, or sabotage, or mechanical failure, or human malice. She sank because there was an iceberg in the water, and because the ship was moving too fast through it, and because the safeguards that were supposed to protect the people aboard her were insufficient. She sank because the confidence that had been built into her every rivet, the confidence of an age that believed sincerely and with some justification that technology had, or was very close to having, dominion over nature, was not warranted. The ocean did not care. The ice did not care. The 30 degrees Fahrenheit of the North Atlantic water in the middle of April did not care who was aboard the ship or how much money they had paid for their ticket or whether the ship was called practically unsinkable by its owners or by its builders or by the popular press. This was not a new lesson. The ocean has been teaching it since the first human being attempted to cross it in something that floated. But the Titanic taught it again, at massive scale and in full view of the whole world, and the teaching took, at least for a while. At least until the next great ship was built and the confidence returned, as it always does, because the alternative to confidence is not crossing the ocean at all, and the ocean must be crossed. The wreck. On September 1st, 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution found the wreck. 2 miles down, in the dark, in the cold, the temperature at that depth is just above freezing, which is partly why the wreck has survived as well as it has. The Titanic lay in 2 sections, as the survivors had always said and the inquiries had always denied. The bow, buried in a field of fine gray-brown silt, was largely intact, the great curved prow still thrusting forward as if the ship were still underway, the hull plating still essentially in place above the break, the interiors, the staterooms, the corridors, the galley, collapsed and filled with sediment, but present. Rusting, yes. Covered with the strange orange icicle formations of iron-eating bacteria, which are slowly consuming the hull and will, eventually, reduce it entirely. But present. The stern was in far worse condition. Torn open, collapsed. The interior completely destroyed by the implosion of air pockets as it sank. The decks separated and scattered over a wide area of the seafloor. The area between the 2 hull sections, approximately a third of a mile of seafloor, was covered with the contents of the ship: coal, dishes, shoes, luggage, bath fittings, a comb, a child's doll's head, a safe that had rusted open and was empty, bottles of wine still corked, a set of keys, a pair of spectacles. The debris field is also, in any morally serious reckoning, a graveyard. It is the resting place of more than 1,000 people whose bodies have long since been consumed by the ocean. Visiting it, which submersibles have done many times in the 4 decades since the discovery, carries a weight that underwater archaeology does not always carry, because the things on the seafloor are not archaeological artifacts in the conventional sense. They are the belongings of specific people who were alive on April 14th, 1912, and who are not alive now. And the shoes, which decompose more slowly than bodies because of the chemistry of the leather, are the shoes of those specific people, and to look at them is to understand that they are not relics but remains. The discovery of the wreck prompted decades of controversy about how the site should be treated. Various expeditions retrieved thousands of artifacts, dishes, luggage, fittings, letters, the crow's nest bell, and these objects are now distributed across museums on both sides of the Atlantic, where they are exhibited as a combination of historical evidence and memorial artifact. The ethics of this retrieval are contested. Some argue that the artifacts are irreplaceable evidence of a pivotal moment in history, best preserved in controlled conditions rather than left to the bacteria. Others argue that the site should be left alone, as a grave is left alone, and that the removal of objects from it is a form of desecration. The debate continues. Meanwhile, the bacteria continue their slow work, and the Titanic continues its slow dissolution. And in perhaps another century, it will be entirely gone, consumed by the microorganisms that have been eating it since the night it sank, the ocean having recovered from itself, at last, the steel it was never meant to hold. Section 14. Memory. The survivors. They were, the survivors, a strange community, bound together by what they had seen, separated by everything else, distributed across 2 continents and a dozen countries, living with varying degrees of success the lives that the accident of the boat or the deck or the decision to go out for air at 10:30 had given them. Some spoke about it freely and often. Others refused to speak about it at all. Lawrence Beasley wrote his account, The Loss of the SS Titanic, within weeks of the disaster, while the memory was still raw and complete, and it became one of the essential documents of the event. Jack Thayer gave interviews sporadically over the years, but became increasingly private about the experience as he aged. He wrote a private memoir in 1940 and died in 1945. Margaret Brown told the story for the rest of her life with undiminished relish, the telling having become part of what she was. Charles Lightoller, the most senior surviving officer, whose testimony shaped the British Inquiry's understanding of events on the bridge, spent years defending the actions of the White Star Line and of Captain Smith, in ways that historians have read as either loyalty or cover-up, depending on their inclinations. He had other adventures. He sailed his private motorboat Sundowner to Dunkirk in 1940 and brought back 130 British soldiers. He never retired from the sea. He died in 1952. J. Bruce Ismay retired from public life almost immediately after the inquiries. He resigned as chairman of the International Mercantile Marine Company in 1913 and lived out his life in relative seclusion. He is one of the disaster's most contested figures, villain, scapegoat, or simply a man whose survival was an accident that history could not forgive him for. The Collier family. Harvey Collier, the husband who was going to buy an apple farm in Idaho, did not survive. Charlotte Collier, his wife, survived with their daughter Marjorie. She wrote an account of her experience, gave interviews to newspapers, and then largely withdrew from public attention and concentrated on the business of raising Marjorie alone in a foreign country with the money from a relief fund that had been established for Titanic survivors. She died in 1914 of tuberculosis. She was 29. The young Irish girl Kate Mullins, who had danced in the third-class general room on the evening of April 14th. She survived and reached New York and made the life in America that she had intended to make, and it may have been a good life, or a difficult life, or an ordinary life, and history does not record which. She lived until 1944. The dead. The dead of the Titanic have been remembered in a variety of ways over the past 100+ years, and the ways in which they have been remembered say as much about the memorializers as they do about the remembered. In the immediate aftermath, the dominant narrative was one of gentlemanly sacrifice, the men who stood aside for women and children, the millionaires who died with dignity, the band that played on. This narrative was useful. It supplied a moral framework for an event that threatened, if examined too closely, to expose the moral failures of the social order that produced it. It emphasized the courage of the individual and minimized the cowardice of the system. It made the Titanic a story about character rather than a story about class. Over time, the narrative has expanded and complicated itself. The differential survival rates have been examined. The locked gates have been documented. The stories of the Irish and Swedish and Croatian and Syrian third-class passengers have been recovered, partially, from the records of the inquiry and the passenger lists and the immigration papers and the occasional memoir or letter. The women who were widowed and left with children and no income, and who received from the relief funds amounts that reflected the same hierarchy as the lifeboat loading. More for first-class survivors, less for second, least for third, have been counted. The result of this expansion is a more honest picture, a disaster that was also a revelation that stripped away the gilded surface of Edwardian confidence and showed, briefly and terribly and very clearly, what was underneath. What was underneath was the ordinary humanity of ordinary people, their courage and their fear, their decency and their selfishness, their love and their panic, organized into a hierarchy that persisted even in catastrophe. What was underneath was the ocean, indifferent, 38 degrees at the surface and cold all the way to the bottom. What we cannot forget. There is a reason the Titanic has retained its hold on the human imagination for more than a century, and it is not, primarily, the scale of the disaster. Greater disasters have been less remembered. It is not the glamour of the first-class passengers, though that has provided biographers with inexhaustible material. It is not, or not only, the drama of the ice and the night and the lifeboats. It is the completeness of the before. It is the fact that the world aboard the Titanic on the evening of April 14, 1912 was so fully realized, so densely populated with living, hoping, specific people. People with card tricks they were still learning and books they hadn't finished, and children in Dublin waiting for letters and business deals to close in New York and new dresses to wear to dinner, and old friends to visit and futures that were not vague, but precise and near, practically tangible, almost visible through the forward porthole of the ship if you looked in exactly the right direction. All of that, destroyed, not by war, not by disease, not by the long, slow attrition of time, by a piece of ice, by 30 seconds, by a helm order and a speed and an iceberg in the dark, and the particular physics of what happens when an enormous ship strikes something at 22 knots in the middle of the North Atlantic. We cannot forget it because we cannot stop recognizing ourselves in it. We cannot stop seeing. In the first-class smoking room where men played cards and talked about New York and did not worry because the ship was unsinkable, we cannot stop seeing in that room the rooms we ourselves occupy, with our own certainties and our own plans and our own unconscious confidence that the ground will hold. We cannot stop seeing, in the third-class locked gates, the structures of our own world that we are more comfortable not examining. We cannot stop seeing, in Ida Strauss sitting down beside her husband on the deck, the thing that we most want from the people we love, and that time will, inevitably, in one way or another, eventually take. We cannot stop seeing, in the musicians playing in the cold, in Wallace Hartley keeping his bow moving as the deck tilted, some argument about what human beings are capable of, some version of ourselves that we want to be capable of, some proof that we are not only the frightened thing that builds a ship and calls it unsinkable, that we are also the thing that stays and plays and makes something beautiful in the dark. Even when the dark is coming in, the ship moves on. The stars are very bright tonight. They were very bright that night. The witnesses agree on this. The lookouts, the officers, the passengers who had been standing on the deck in the cold. The stars were extraordinary, bright the way they are only in the absence of the moon, in the clear dry air above the North Atlantic in April, with no light pollution for 1,000 miles in any direction. You could see the Milky Way. You could see the horizon. It is not nothing to have seen that. On the bottom of the ocean, 2 miles down, the Titanic lies in the dark. The bacteria have been at her for more than a century. The hull is dissolving. The staterooms are silted over. The grand staircase, that famous image, the wide mahogany sweep of it, is long gone, collapsed into the sediment. But the keel is there, and the bow, and the forward windlass, and somewhere in the debris field, in the sediment of the sea floor, the individual atoms that were once the pages of letters that were never delivered, the atoms that were once the dress that Ida Strauss wore to dinner, the atoms that were once the violin that Wallace Hartley played until he could play no more. Those atoms are still there. They are always there. The Atlantic does not lose what it is given. It takes what it is given and holds it, in the dark and the cold, and it moves on, carrying it, slowly, in the deep currents that run underneath the surface of the world, that have been running since long before there were ships or people to sail them or icebergs to fear. The ship is down. The people are gone. The stars that they saw that night are the same stars we see tonight, because stars, unlike ships, are not destroyed by time on any human scale. They are still there. They are still bright. And in the brightness of them, in that specific light, that ancient light, that light which traveled for years to reach the eyes of two lookouts in a crow's nest who were looking for something else and almost missed it, in that brightness, every one of them is still aboard, still dancing in the third-class general room, still finishing their 11-course dinner, still at the card table, still holding hands, still, in the particular permanence of the past tense, alive, still making their plans, still heading, in the dark and the brightness, toward whatever was waiting for them on the other side of the water. The ship moves on. The stars are very bright tonight. The events depicted in this documentary are drawn from the testimony of survivors given to the United States Senate Inquiry, April, May 1912, and the British Board of Trade Inquiry, July 1912, as well as from the extensive historical literature on the disaster, including the accounts of Lawrence Beasley, Jack Thayer, Charles Lightoller, and many others, where dialogue is implied or specific thoughts attributed to historical individuals. These are reconstructions based on documented accounts, survivor testimony, and historical record. The documentary does not claim to know with certainty the interior experience of those who did not survive. The Titanic wreck was discovered on September 1, 1985 by an expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard. It rests at approximately 41 degrees 43 minutes 57 seconds north, 49 degrees 56 minutes 49 seconds west, at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet. The International Ice Patrol continues to operate today.